I don't know why I always feel a little nervous when I move into a new place. It's not that I'm afraid of the dark or of being alone. Not really. It's more like the quiet of a new apartment, the kind of quiet that waits for you to make a sound, as if it's listening. The building itself was old, older than anything I'd lived in before. Its bricks were darkened from years of city grime. The iron fire escape rattling faintly whenever the wind picked up. I remember looking up at it from the street, carrying my boxes, thinking that it had a kind of patience, like it had been standing there long enough to watch hundreds of lives pass through, without ever moving itself. When I stepped inside, the smell hit me first. Old wood, faint mildew, and something else. I couldn't place it. A dry, almost metallic scent that lingered in the hallways. The stairwell was narrow, and the steps creaked under my weight in a way that made me pause every time. I told myself it was nothing, just old wood, just an old building. My apartment was on the third floor. The key turned in the lock with surprising effort, scraping slightly like it didn't want to be used. When I finally pushed the door open, I was greeted by the faint mustiness of an empty room. Sunlight fell in through tall windows, cutting soft rectangles into the wooden floor, dust motes drifting lazily in the air. It looked ordinary at first, quiet and unassuming. But then I noticed it. The first sign that this place wasn't entirely empty. A diary, half open, lying on the small kitchen table. Its leather cover was scuffed, the pages yellowed. The handwriting inside was neat, deliberate, though some pages ended mid-sentence, leaving thoughts unfinished. I don't know why I picked it up. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the faint unease that had started growing the moment I turned the key. The entries were mundane at first, shopping lists, notes about bills, reminders to pick up laundry, but slowly the tone changed. The words became softer, almost whispered in print, as if the writer was speaking to someone only they could see. "I think they are watching," one entry read. Another, "I can't tell if the door closes on its own or if I forget that I shut it." My skin prickled as I read. It was the kind of writing that made you stop, hold your breath, and listen for something that might not be there. I set the diary down, trying to tell myself it was just someone being dramatic. People worry about things that aren't real all the time. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the apartment was aware. Over the next few hours, I began unpacking my things, trying to get comfortable. Every time I opened a closet or a drawer, I thought I caught a movement in the corner of my eye. Shadows that seemed slightly darker than the rest of the room, shapes that didn't quite match the furniture. But when I turned, nothing was there. Just the apartment waiting. And then there were the doors that refused to stay closed. The bathroom door would swing open quietly when I turned my back. The bedroom door would creak slowly as if someone had just let it move. I checked the hinges, everything seemed fine. There was no wind. No one else had a key. And yet they moved. I started closing doors twice, 3 times, and still, by the time I returned from the kitchen or the hall, they had shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. I told myself it was my imagination, exhaustion from moving, the strain of carrying boxes and stairs and locks. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I could feel the apartment pressing in on me quietly, like it was settling around me, testing the new tenant. And then the scratches started. At first they were faint, just little lines in the corner of the bedroom wall. I thought it was the cat from the previous tenant or maybe some marks left from furniture. But the more I looked, the more I saw. Faint, thin scratches climbing up the wall, almost claw-like but precise. They weren't random. They had a rhythm, a pattern, like someone had been tracing shapes slowly over the years. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the tiny ridges beneath my fingertips, and a shiver went down my spine. At night, the apartment felt different. The city outside was quiet, the hum of distant traffic low and steady. I would lie in bed, listening to the soft creak of the floorboards, the occasional rattle of the radiator. But sometimes there were sounds that didn't belong. Footsteps, perhaps, light and careful, on the floor above or below me. A whisper almost, brushing past the doorframe. Nothing loud, nothing startling, just there. I began sleeping with the lights on, one on the nightstand, casting a soft circle of warmth in the darkness. The rest of the apartment dissolved into shadows, corners where the furniture met the wall, where the ceiling and the floor joined in angles that the eye could never fully measure. It was in those corners I felt it most, a weight, a presence, silent and patient. During the day, I tried to normalize it. I cleaned, rearranged the furniture, even moved the diary to a shelf. But I noticed subtle changes. The diary would be slightly shifted, open to another page, or the pen next to it would have moved. The closet door in the hall would be ajar, though I had closed it tightly. And sometimes, when I passed the bathroom mirror, I thought I saw a shadow move behind me, faster than a blink, gone before I could turn. I began to imagine what the previous tenant had seen. I pictured them here, packing slowly at night, staring at the diary, listening to the apartment breathe. I imagined them scribbling half-formed sentences, scratching the walls in some desperate attempt to communicate something, to leave a mark that someone, anyone, might notice. It was a strange mix of fear and fascination. I couldn't leave, though I considered it. The apartment had a quiet hold over me, subtle and insistent. There was a rhythm to it, a slow, persistent pulse that matched my own heartbeat when I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. I began to understand, in a way that terrified me, what it meant to inhabit this space, to be the new tenant, to feel watched by walls and doors and faint scratches in the wood. Sometimes I speak aloud to the apartment, softly, in whispers. I'm here. I'm just moving in. I don't want trouble. It feels polite somehow, as if acknowledgement matters. I don't know what listens. I only know that the apartment has memories, and they linger quietly like shadows behind the eyes. And so I live here now. The diary remains on the shelf half-read, the scratches climb the walls, and the doors continue their slow, patient shifting. I have grown accustomed to the small creaks and whispers, though my sleep is broken, uneven. And at night, when the city hum is low and the shadows stretch, I sometimes swear I hear a faint voice, almost a whisper, that says, "Don't forget we're still here." I don't know who "we" is. I don't know if I want to, but the apartment knows I hear it. And somehow, that makes all the difference. The first night I really noticed it, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. The apartment had settled into that familiar quiet, the kind of silence that seems almost alive. Every creak of the floorboards, every soft rattle of the radiator felt amplified, as if the walls themselves were breathing. I told myself it was nothing, just an old building adjusting to a new tenant. But then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like someone whispering behind the walls. At first I convinced myself it was the wind, slipping through cracks in the windows, weaving between the bricks. But the sound was too deliberate. It wasn't random. There were words there, or fragments of words, carried in a voice too soft to make sense of. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, young or old. It was more like the sound of someone speaking just beyond the edge of hearing, careful not to be noticed. I sat up in bed, my heart slow and steady, but my mind alert, straining to listen. The whispers came again, barely audible, brushing against the quiet. My first thought was that it was the previous tenant, somehow still leaving traces behind. But that was impossible. Diaries don't speak. Furniture doesn't whisper. I got up and moved cautiously through the apartment. The hallway was dark except for the faint light from the street outside filtering through the windows. Every step I took made the floorboards groan, a sound so familiar now that it seemed almost like part of the whispering itself. I stopped at the doorway of the kitchen and listened. The whispers faded, leaving only the gentle hum of the city beyond the windows. There was a peculiar smell in the air, one I hadn't noticed during the day. It was musty, like old fabric that had never fully dried, and beneath that, a hint of something sharper, metallic, almost like rusted iron. My gaze fell on a corner of the kitchen I hadn't paid much attention to before. There, half hidden by the shadows, was an old chair. Its fabric was torn, exposing the brittle stuffing beneath. But what made me pause were the stains, dark, irregular shapes that I didn't want to think about too closely. They didn't belong to the kind of life I normally associated with furniture. I took a step closer, feeling the weight of the apartment's stillness pressing against me. The chair seemed ordinary in daylight, but in the soft glow of the streetlight, it felt different, as though it carried some memory I wasn't meant to touch. I ran my fingers lightly along the edges, careful not to disturb anything. The texture was rough and slightly sticky in places, like the surface had absorbed 1,000 forgotten nights. The whispers returned, faint and fluttering, almost teasing. I could feel them more than hear them now, pressing at the edges of my mind. They didn't form words I could understand, just fragments, syllables that seemed half-remembered. I pressed my hands to my ears, shaking my head, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, that the mind played tricks in quiet spaces. But deep down, I knew it wasn't imagination. Something or someone was still here. I began to explore more methodically, checking each corner, each closet, each narrow space that the apartment offered. In the living room, a small armoire leaned against the wall. Its doors were closed, but I could feel a chill emanating from it. I hesitated, heart tightening, then opened the doors slowly. Inside were old linens, yellowed and brittle, and a few forgotten trinkets left by the previous tenant. Nothing overtly strange. Yet when I closed it, I swore I felt the air shift, like the room itself had exhaled. Moving on, I checked the bedroom again. The diary was still on the shelf, open to the same page I had left it on. But there was another item I hadn't noticed before, a small wooden box tucked behind the books. I picked it up carefully, feeling the grain of the wood under my fingers. The lid was loose, and when I opened it, I found a collection of notes, carefully folded. The handwriting was neat, but jagged in places, as if the writer had pressed the pen harder at certain moments. The words were fragmented, unfinished thoughts. They watch when I sleep. Don't answer the knock. Always in the corner. The words made my chest tight. I placed the box down gently, trying not to disturb anything else. My mind kept returning to the whispers, now a soft murmur at the edge of perception. I could feel them drifting through the apartment, brushing against the walls, pressing faintly against my skin. It was impossible to ignore. I tried lying back down, hoping sleep would offer some respite. But as I closed my eyes, the whispers seemed to follow, echoing inside my head, rhythmically, like a pulse I could not control. I imagined shadows moving just beyond the corner of my vision, stretching slowly along the walls. I could almost sense someone standing in the doorway, observing, patient and still. After what felt like hours, I rose again, drawn toward the source of the sound. I followed it softly, moving from room to room, letting my ears guide me rather than my eyes. The whispers led me toward the bathroom, where the door was slightly ajar. I didn't remember leaving it open. The light from the street made the edges of the room glow faintly. Inside, the tiles were cracked, and the bathtub was stained with long-forgotten residue. There was a sense of heaviness there, a lingering weight of moments long past, moments that someone, or something, had carried through time. I leaned against the doorway, listening. The whispers were gone, leaving only the soft creak of the building settling. And then in the far corner of the room, I noticed it, another chair. Smaller, older, its paint peeling. And on the floor beneath it, faint scratches, tiny, erratic lines as if someone had pressed their fingernails against the tiles. I knelt down and traced them with my fingertips. The lines didn't form words, not really, but they felt deliberate, intentional. A message I couldn't decipher, meant only for eyes patient enough to look. I spent the rest of the night moving slowly through the apartment, following the whispers wherever they led, cataloging the furniture, the scratches, the faint stains and the faint smells. Everything seemed alive in its own subtle way, each item holding some residue of the previous tenant's presence. By the time dawn began to break, the city outside quieted into soft hums and the whispers faded. I returned to bed, exhausted but alert, knowing sleep would be uneasy. The apartment had left its mark on me already. I could feel it in my mind, in the corners of my vision, in the soft pressure against my chest as I lay beneath the blanket. I realized that night that this place wasn't just a building. It was a witness, patient and quiet, to all the lives that had passed through it. And somehow, it wanted me to understand it, to recognize the traces it carried, the voices it held. I still hear them even now when the apartment settles in the evening. Soft, almost imperceptible whispers brushing along the walls and floors. They never come too close. They never shout. But they are there, waiting, patient, like shadows that remember more than I ever will. And I wonder each night as I lie in bed listening to them, are they the echoes of the last tenant or something older, something that has always been here, watching, waiting, whispering? I had spent the previous nights drifting between wakefulness and restless sleep, my mind haunted by the faint whispers and the soft creaks of the apartment. The diary and the small wooden box had revealed fragments of the previous tenant's life, but nothing prepared me for what I would find that evening. It started when I noticed the envelope lying on the kitchen counter. I didn't remember seeing it before. It was unremarkable in most ways, a plain cream color, but it was sealed with a wax stamp, faded and cracked. My name was written across it in neat, deliberate handwriting. My name exactly, though I had never seen it before. I picked it up slowly, feeling the weight of something unspoken pressing into my chest. I held it in my hands for a long moment, feeling a strange pull, a curiosity laced with hesitation. The apartment had already taught me to be cautious. Everything here carried memory, shadows of those who had been, lingering like mist. And yet I knew I had to open it. I slid the letter free, breaking the brittle seal, and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was familiar, echoing the diary, precise but slightly trembling. I began to read slowly, deliberately, letting each word sink in. To whoever reads this, it began, if you have found me here, it means I am gone. Or perhaps I am still in some way trapped by these walls. There is a presence in this apartment, something that watches. It does not come for everyone, only for those who listen, who notice, who pay attention. And now it is paying attention to you. I felt a cold pressure in my chest as I read those lines. The words were calm, almost gentle, yet they carried a weight that made my skin tingle. I read on, each sentence slower than the last, as if the writer had known I would read it exactly like this, in the dim glow of the city lights spilling through the windows. At first I thought it was a shadow of my own mind. I told myself I was tired, that the whispers were nothing. But the apartment has patience. It knows when you notice, when you are aware. It does not shout, it does not strike. It waits, always waiting, and sometimes it moves things or leaves marks, so you remember it is here. I write this because I can no longer ignore it, and perhaps in some way this will warn you. I paused, looking around the kitchen. The apartment seemed darker than before, the corners deeper, the shadows longer. The soft hum of the city outside felt distant, muted by some unseen presence pressing in through the walls. I set the letter down briefly, my hands trembling slightly, then picked it up again, compelled to continue. There is someone else, the letter read, someone who has lingered longer than I ever imagined. Not a friend, not a neighbor. Someone who watches from the corners, who waits for the smallest slip of attention. I cannot see them clearly, not always, but I know they are there. I have left traces, small signs, hoping they will not find me entirely. I do not know if you will understand, but you must be cautious. The doors, the furniture, the walls, they all remember. And they tell what has passed, what has been unnoticed, and what is now. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The diary, the scratches, the subtle shifts of the doors, they weren't random. Nothing in this apartment was random. My pulse quickened, slow and deliberate. As I listened to the quiet around me, I could feel the weight of the apartment pressing in, and the faint impression that I was not alone. If you are reading this, I hope you are careful, the letter continued. I do not know who watches me, and I do not know who watches you. I only know that they are patient and they are always learning. Do not dismiss the small movements, the sounds that seem too soft to be real. They are real. They are very real. I do not know if I have angered them or simply noticed them too clearly. Either way, I am leaving this note so you might survive longer than I have. Do not turn your back. Do not ignore the signs. Listen always, watch always, and understand some presences never leave. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. The room felt colder, the shadows around the corners deeper, almost tangible. I opened my eyes and looked toward the doorway. The apartment seemed unchanged, ordinary, yet I could not shake the feeling of eyes or something like eyes in the dark, patient, quiet, and unmoving, waiting. I set the letter down carefully on the counter and moved slowly through the apartment, retracing steps I had taken countless times before. The chair in the corner of the kitchen, the scratches in the bedroom, the faint stains in the living room, all of it now felt like a language I was only beginning to understand. The apartment had a memory, it had a witness, and it knew I was here. I went to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, the letter folded carefully in my hands. I thought of the previous tenant, imagining them packing the rooms at night, whispering to themselves, writing in the diary, leaving marks on the walls. I wondered if they had ever slept, or if the presence that watched them had kept them awake, patient, silent, and unseen. The thought made my stomach turn. If it had watched them, it was watching me now. I tried to focus on the sound of my own breathing, the soft hum of the radiator, the distant murmur of the city. But the apartment was too still, too deliberate. I could feel the weight of attention pressing from the corners, the ceiling, the floors beneath me. I put the letter down again, tracing the lines with my fingertips. I realized I had been holding my breath and exhaled slowly. The letter had been a warning, but also a confession, a way to reach someone who might notice, who might understand. And I understood more than I wanted to. I thought of leaving, of abandoning the apartment altogether. But a part of me, curious, stubborn, or foolish, knew I could not. This place had a hold on me, subtle but unyielding. The diary, the box of notes, the scratches, the whispers, they had drawn me in, and now I was part of it, at least in some small, lingering way. The final lines of the letter stayed with me long after I put it down. Some presences never leave. I repeated them softly to myself, almost a whisper, as if speaking them aloud might give them shape, make them tangible. The apartment was quiet, but I could feel it responding in the smallest ways. The creak of the floorboard under my foot, the faint rustle of the radiator, the gentle pressure at the corners of the room. I spent the rest of that night sitting quietly in the bedroom, the letter beside me, letting the presence settle in alongside me. There was no movement, no sudden noise. Just a patient, deliberate awareness that seemed to drift along the walls and floors. I imagined it standing in the shadows, watching me, listening, waiting. I could not see it, could not name it, but I knew it was there. Sleep came in broken moments, light and shallow. I dreamed of shadows stretching across walls, of doors opening and closing on their own, of whispers forming words I could almost understand but never quite grasp. I woke often, heart slow but uneasy, listening for the faintest sign, the smallest shift in the room. When morning arrived, the city outside was bright and ordinary, indifferent to the quiet horrors that lingered inside the apartment. I looked at the diary, at the box, at the letter. Each piece carried memory, traces of someone who had noticed the presence before me, and I realized with a shiver I could not shake that the apartment had chosen me now, as it had chosen them. I do not know how long I will stay here. I do not know if the presence will ever leave, but I have learned to live with it as best I can, to move quietly, to listen carefully, to acknowledge its patience. Some nights, the whispers return, faint but insistent, reminding me that this apartment remembers, that it watches, that it waits. And perhaps in some ways I am not just the tenant, I am part of it now. The letter remains on the counter, folded neatly, a warning and a confession. I have read it countless times, each reading leaving me more aware, more cautious. And each night when I lie down in the dark, I remember the words, "Some presences never leave." I do not know who or what remains, but I feel it always patient and quiet, a shadow in the corners, a presence in the stillness. And I suspect with a clarity that chills me to the bone that it will never truly let me go. I've worked as a night security guard for years, and I've seen my share of empty streets, silent office buildings, and locked doors that creak just to remind you they're still there. But nothing quite compares to the stillness of a nearly empty parking garage after midnight. There's a kind of quiet there that isn't just the absence of sound. It's the presence of nothing, stretched across concrete floors and steel beams, waiting for you to notice. I clock in at 11, my boots clicking against the polished concrete as I make my way through the first floor. The lights hum softly above me, fluorescent tubes flickering every so often, casting long, thin shadows along the rows of parked cars. Most of them are empty. People have left for the night, offices shuttered, streets silent. But I can never shake the feeling that I'm being watched, even when no one is around. My rounds are methodical. I check the stairwells, the elevators, the cameras, and the locked service doors. Everything is in order, perfectly mundane. Yet by the time I reach the second level, I start noticing the small things. A car that was facing one way when I passed earlier now sits turned slightly, just a few degrees, as if someone had adjusted it. A tire mark, a scuff on the floor, subtle enough that you could almost convince yourself it's an optical illusion. But after years on these shifts, I've learned to trust what I see, even when it doesn't make sense. I walk slowly, my flashlight tracing the edges of the concrete pillars. The shadows are long and lean, twisting in shapes that don't quite match the cars or the stairwells. Sometimes in the corner of my eye, I think I see movement, flickers that vanish when I look directly at them. I tell myself it's fatigue, the mind playing tricks in the low light. But there's a rhythm to it, a pattern that makes my skin tingle. I stop at the middle section of the garage, leaning against a pillar. I try to focus on the hum of the lights, the faint echo of my own breathing. Then I notice it, a shadow, too tall and too thin to belong to any human, stretching across the far wall. It moves slightly when I blink, shifting like smoke in a draft. I freeze, heart beating slower than it should, straining my ears. Nothing else makes a sound. The air is still, cold in a way that creeps under your skin. I move on, telling myself it's a trick of perspective, a reflection, maybe even a trick of my own imagination. But later, as I reach the far corner, I notice another car, one I hadn't seen before, or maybe one that wasn't there earlier. Its headlights are off, engine cold, but it sits at an angle that seems deliberate, almost as if it's waiting for something. I shine my flashlight over it. Nothing. No one inside, nothing in the windows. Yet I get the feeling, the undeniable pull, that I am not alone. I continue my rounds, each step slower than the last. The stairwells echo softly as I ascend to the third level. Here it's quieter, colder. The city hum doesn't reach this high. The air smells faintly of oil, old tires, and something else I can't identify, something sharp and metallic like iron faintly rusting. The shadows are darker here, longer, almost reaching for me as I pass. I tell myself to breathe, to slow down. It's just the height, the emptiness, just routine. At the far end of the third level, I notice another shadow. I freeze again. It doesn't move like a person, but it shifts subtly, almost with intention, curling around a concrete pillar and disappearing when I try to get a better look. I shine my flashlight, tracing every line and surface. Nothing. Just the smooth floor, the walls, the occasional stain from a leaking pipe above. But the sense of being watched is growing, heavy and patient. I walk past it slowly, deliberately, trying to act normal. My flashlight catches something low on the ground, a pair of footprints that weren't there before. They are faint, small, pressed lightly into the dust on the concrete. They lead toward the corner where the shadow had been, then stop abruptly. I crouch, examining them. They aren't mine. They don't belong to any shoes I know. They're too small to be human, or maybe too precise, carved neatly into the floor as if someone or something had marked its path deliberately. I shake my head, trying to steady my nerves. Maybe it's a maintenance worker, some harmless presence, something I can explain rationally. But I know the garage too well. There should be no one else. Not at this hour. The security cameras are quiet, recording in silent loops, showing only empty floors. I check my watch. It's past 1 a.m. I am alone, or so I think. I decide to finish my patrol on the top level. The elevator smells faintly of oil and cleaning chemicals, the walls pressed close as it climbs slowly. The doors open with a soft ding, and I step out onto the roof. Here, the city stretches wide, lights twinkling, distant sirens faint, almost musical. But even up here, the garage feels different. The shadows stretch longer than they should, bending around the edges of cars, pillars, and the stairwell entrance. I notice another movement, subtle this time, like a dark ripple across the concrete. I follow it with my eyes, but it disappears, leaving nothing to mark its passage. I move along the edge, flashlight sweeping every corner, every pillar. The wind picks up, rustling loose papers near the stairwell, and I tell myself it's only the draft, only the night. But then I hear it, a soft, deliberate scraping, faint enough that I question whether it's real. I stop, straining to hear. There it is again, just beyond the stairwell entrance, and then silence. I shine my light toward it. Nothing. I take a deep breath, counting slowly to calm myself. I've seen strange things before, shadows, movement, odd marks on floors and walls. But there's a difference between anomalies and awareness. And here in this garage, I feel it. Something watching, something patient, something that knows the rhythm of my rounds better than I do. I continue walking, scanning every car, every corner. Occasionally, I notice a car slightly shifted from its previous position, a door slightly ajar that I had closed earlier, or faint scratches in the concrete that seemed too precise, deliberate to be random. Every step adds weight to the tension, slow and insistent. By the time I reach the stairwell to head back down, my pulse is steady but tight, muscles alert. The garage is silent, almost unnaturally so. I tell myself it's just another night, just another shift, routine and uneventful. Yet as I descend, I can't shake the feeling of eyes or shadows following me from above, just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. When I finally reach the first level, I pause, leaning against a pillar. The hum of the lights seems louder, almost insistent. I glance around at the cars, the empty spaces, the corners where shadows bend in impossible ways. Nothing moves now, nothing visible, and yet I know the garage hasn't let me go. I can feel it lingering, patient, quiet, a presence that observes without moving. I finish my patrol and sit in the small security booth, lights dimmed, monitors showing only empty floors. I rub my eyes and take a sip of coffee, trying to convince myself that everything is normal. And in a way, it is. There is no one else here. Yet the sense of being observed remains, settling in my chest, pressing against my skin. The shadows move when I blink. Footprints appear where none should exist. And sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I catch a dark shape that doesn't belong. I tell myself it's just the night, just the stillness of an empty garage, just routine. But I know better. The garage is patient. It waits. And sometimes it shows you the things that are too slow, too quiet to be explained. Things you notice only if you're careful, only if you pay attention, only if you stay until the end of your shift. And I have learned to stay. The nights in the garage had become a pattern, predictable yet unsettling in their quietness. I had settled into the rhythm of my rounds, but over the past few weeks, I noticed something strange, cars disappearing. Not all of them, not at once, just one or two, always subtle, always leaving me second-guessing myself. I would round a corner, scanning the rows, and a vehicle that had been parked there hours before would vanish, leaving an empty spot, the concrete beneath it undisturbed, except for faint scuff marks that hinted it had moved. At first I blamed maintenance, maybe towing, or a tenant who had parked somewhere else. But the pattern became too consistent, too deliberate. Each time a car disappeared, it seemed as though the garage itself shifted around it, a silent witness to something that didn't belong. I began noting the times and locations, trying to make sense of it, but the more I recorded, the stranger it felt. One night after finishing my usual patrol, I found 3 cars missing on the second level. Not random cars either. They were all older models, some with rusted panels, others with dents that had made them familiar landmarks for me. The spots where they had been left faint impressions on the concrete, tire marks that didn't match anything I remembered seeing before. My heart started to beat faster, slow but deliberate, as I realized that this wasn't about simple mistakes. Something was happening here, something patient, calculated, and unseen. I retraced the spots carefully, scanning the garage. Shadows clung to the corners, stretching unnaturally in the dim fluorescent light. Every sound, the hum of the overhead lights, the creak of the distant fire escape, felt amplified, sharper, almost alive. I caught glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, dark shapes that didn't align with anything human. I turned to look, but nothing was there. Only the rows of cars waiting. I remembered a note I'd seen weeks earlier, scrawled in black marker on the far wall of the stairwell near the third level. At the time, I thought it was graffiti, teenagers, maybe some bored vandals. But now it seemed different. The message was simple, blunt. They watch, always. I decided to follow the pattern, check the areas where the cars had vanished. My flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the concrete, bouncing off steel beams, illuminating abandoned items left in corners, discarded shopping bags, a pair of shoes, a broken umbrella. Nothing remarkable, yet each item felt deliberate, as if someone wanted me to notice them. My skin prickled, goosebumps rising as I moved slowly along the rows. It was on the far end of the third level that I noticed something new, a stairwell I didn't recall seeing before, hidden behind a cluster of columns and a stack of abandoned carts. The door was narrow, unmarked, partially open. The air around it felt colder, heavier. I hesitated, flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. My pulse slowed and picked up at the same time, a slow, insistent rhythm that made me acutely aware of every step I took. I pushed the door gently and peered inside. Concrete steps descended into darkness, the walls lined with more graffiti. This wasn't the usual scrawl of bored vandals. The markings were jagged, sharp, almost frantic names, dates, cryptic symbols, phrases like "gone too long and they wait below." There were dark stains on the steps, old, dried, but unmistakable in their shapes. I swallowed hard and stepped inside, flashlight tracing the descending steps. The deeper I went, the colder it became. The garage above felt like another world, distant and unreal. Here, the shadows pressed closer, folding into the corners, curling around objects left behind. Empty cans, broken chairs, scraps of paper littered the floor, abandoned items that whispered of lives interrupted. I began to understand that this hidden stairwell was more than a passage. It was a repository of memory, of absence, of things that had vanished without explanation. I found a corner where the shadows pooled and froze, a sudden sharp stillness that made me hold my breath. There was an old bicycle frame leaning against the wall, rusted and bent, with a single shoe caught in the spokes. A tattered jacket lay nearby, stained as if dropped in a hurry. The air smelled faintly of mildew and iron, an odor that made my stomach tight. I shone my flashlight over the walls, nodding more graffiti, more cryptic warnings. Do not look back, and they know your rounds. I realized with a sinking feeling that the garage wasn't just empty. It was alive in its own way. It remembered. It shifted. And now somehow it was teaching me, marking me, letting me see what happened to those who didn't pay attention. The cars weren't just disappearing. They were being drawn, guided, or absorbed into the shadows that clung to the corners and stairwells. My own car was parked on the first level near the elevator. I decided to finish the patrol quickly and check it before heading to the booth. But as I reached the spot, I froze. The concrete was empty. My car, my personal vehicle, was gone. Nothing remained but a faint rectangle where the tires had pressed, slightly dusty, the outline crisp against the worn surface. I blinked, unsure of what I was seeing, convinced it was some mistake. Maybe someone had moved it for maintenance, though I had been meticulous about noting its position. I circled the area, flashlight scanning every row, every shadow, every corner. Nothing. Not even a distant engine hum, not a single reflection in the windows. My pulse picked up, slow and steady, like a drumbeat I couldn't ignore. I felt the weight of the garage pressing around me, a patient, deliberate presence that seemed to stretch along every concrete beam, every pillar, every darkened corner. I moved to the stairwell, thinking maybe someone had brought it down another level. The steps were silent, more silent than before, as if absorbing the sound of my footsteps. Shadows shifted along the walls, stretching into shapes that didn't belong to me, shapes that didn't belong to anything I recognized. The graffiti seemed to leer at me, the jagged lines forming teeth, mouths, eyes that weren't there before. I tried to steady my breathing, whispering to myself that it was just my mind, just the fatigue of night shifts, just the emptiness. But I knew better. The stairwell opened into a narrow corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly. More abandoned items were scattered here. Shopping bags, crates, chairs, and a few old license plates leaning against the walls. I touched one carefully, noting the rust and peeling paint. It felt deliberate, as if someone had left these traces for me to follow, or maybe to warn me. My heart tightened. Each step felt heavier, the air thicker, almost breathing around me. I thought of the previous nights, the disappearing cars, the shadows, the faint whispers that had brushed along the corners of my mind. I had tried to rationalize, to catalog, to ignore. But now, confronted with the absence of my own car, I realized it didn't matter. The garage was patient, and it had been learning, watching, waiting. It had chosen to reveal itself slowly, piece by piece, and now I was part of the pattern. I retraced my steps back toward the elevator, flashlights sweeping over every corner. The shadows seemed to retreat, folding back into the edges of the walls, hiding in the corners, patient, deliberate. I reached the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. The hum of the motor was the only sound. The doors opened slowly, revealing the first level, empty and unchanged, except for the absence of my car. I returned to the security booth, shaken, coffee cooling in my hands. The monitors showed empty floors, the cars gone as if they had never existed. My own eyes kept wandering to the shadows in the corners of the garage, to the darkened stairwell, to the graffiti, to the faint outlines of objects I couldn't identify in the gloom. I had no answers, only the sense that the garage had claimed something from me, that my vigilance mattered, and yet was not enough. The rest of the night passed in slow, deliberate unease. Each time I glanced at the empty space where my car should have been, my chest tightened. I thought of the graffiti, the abandoned items, the hidden stairwell. The garage had a memory, a method, and a presence that was patient beyond reason. And somewhere in the corners, in the dark recesses, I knew it waited still, quiet, deliberate, and unseen. When my shift ended, I left on foot, the cool night air a thin comfort. I glanced back at the garage, lights humming softly, shadows stretching. The missing cars, the graffiti, the stairwell, it all lingered in my mind, patient, deliberate, and unresolved. And I knew with a quiet certainty that I would return. Not because I wanted to, but because the garage had chosen me to see, to notice, to witness what it remembered. I didn't know when I would get my car back. I didn't know if I ever would. And somehow, that made everything feel heavier, slower, and infinitely more deliberate. The garage had taught me that patience was part of its nature, that absence was as meaningful as presence, and that it would never truly let go of what it claimed. The subway station had been abandoned for decades, forgotten by everyone except a few urban explorers like me. I had heard stories. Rumors passed quietly between people who enjoyed wandering the hidden veins of the city, that the station had closed abruptly, that trains had ceased stopping there overnight, that something lingered beneath the surface. None of it prepared me for the stillness I found when I first stepped down into its depths. The entrance was hidden behind a narrow alley, a rusted metal door half obscured by graffiti and debris. I pushed it open slowly, feeling the resistance of decades-old rust grinding beneath my fingers. A sharp metallic scent hit me, mingled with damp concrete and the faint, sour smell of old water. The air was colder than the streets above, heavy, thick, and still. It pressed against my chest, and I took a deep breath, feeling the silence settle around me. The first step onto the platform was careful, deliberate. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the darkness, illuminating peeling tiles, corroded railings, and the occasional forgotten object. A rusted newspaper dispenser, a tattered piece of leather, an empty bottle whose label had long since faded. Every surface seemed to whisper stories I couldn't yet understand. I moved slowly, each footfall echoing softly, mingling with the occasional distant drip of water. The echoes bounced along the walls, long and hollow, like the place itself was exhaling. I told myself it was just the architecture, just the empty tunnels carrying sound in odd, unnatural ways. But every drip, every faint clang of metal, felt deliberate, patient, as if the station had been waiting for someone to notice. The posters were the first clues, faded and torn, plastered along the walls near the old ticket booths. I knelt down to examine one. The colors had bled into each other, the paper curling and brittle with age. There were faces on some of them, lost in the blur of time, their eyes hollow, expressions frozen in moments of fear or despair. Some posters carried warnings, others seemed to advertise events long forgotten. And then there were the small, hand-scrawled notes pasted over some of the original print, cryptic messages, initials, dates. I traced a finger over one that read, "Never come alone. They watch from the tracks." I swallowed, a cold shiver traveling along my spine. I tried to rationalize it. Graffiti, pranks, the work of bored teenagers decades ago. But the station felt different. The silence had weight, and the shadows pressed into the corners as if they knew I was there. I shined my flashlight along the platform. The tracks stretched into darkness, curving out of sight, the rails corroded and pitted with rust. I imagined the trains that once ran here, the people who once stood waiting, the lives that had passed through this place. The further I moved along the platform, the more the silence seemed to thicken. The dripping water echoed again, slower this time, more deliberate. I turned to look, flashlight sweeping the dark tunnels, but there was nothing. No rats, no debris falling, no signs of movement beyond my own presence. Just the station, breathing in the darkness. I found a stairwell leading down further, into what I assumed were maintenance tunnels or storage areas. The steps were uneven, coated in a layer of dust so thick it left footprints from each careful step. The walls were streaked with rust and grime, patches of paint flacking in long, thin curls. Somewhere beneath the city, the water dripped again, faint but constant, a reminder that this place was alive in its own way, even if no human had been here for decades. In one corner, I noticed a small pile of abandoned items, a broken helmet, a rusted tool, a few notebooks yellowed with age. I picked up one of the notebooks, flipping through the pages carefully. The handwriting was hurried, cramped, a mixture of numbers, dates, and fragments of sentences. Some entries mentioned maintenance work, schedules, and repairs. Others hinted at strange occurrences, equipment moving on its own, shadows where there shouldn't be shadows, noises that couldn't be explained. The pages were smudged, water-stained, as if someone had left them in haste or perhaps fear. I paused, flashlight resting on a wall where the plaster had crumbled. Beneath the decay, I saw scratches, thin lines etched deep into the concrete. They formed shapes I didn't recognize at first, symbols maybe, but the longer I stared, the more they seemed intentional, deliberate. Someone had been here before me, someone who had tried to leave a mark, a warning, a record of what they had seen. The air smelled sharper here, tinged with iron and decay. I could feel the dampness clinging to my clothes, my hair, my skin. Every breath carried a faint metallic taste. The dripping continued, distant but echoing through the tunnels, a slow rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I realized I had been holding my breath without noticing, straining to hear, straining to see, straining to understand what had happened in this place. I moved slowly along the tunnels, following the drips, shining my light on old support beams, corroded pipes, and discarded tools. The further I went, the more the walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching longer, curling at the edges of my vision. I tried to convince myself it was just the darkness, that my imagination was creating shapes where none existed. But every instinct in my body told me I wasn't alone. Something lingered in the corners, patient, deliberate, unseen, but aware. I found another section of the station, a small room that had once housed electrical panels and control equipment. The door hung from a single hinge, creaking softly as I pushed it open. Inside, the floor was littered with papers, tools, and broken equipment. Rust had claimed almost everything. Yet in the faint beam of my flashlight, I noticed a few posters on the wall, more scrawled messages, another warning. "They watch from below. Keep moving." The phrase sent a chill down my spine. I traced the letters with my finger, hesitant, reluctant to acknowledge what the words implied. The station had history, of that I was certain. Crimes, disappearances, forgotten events that the city above no longer remembered. And in this silence, in this rust and decay, I could feel the echoes of those histories lingering, brushing against the walls, pressing into my mind. I paused again at the far end of the platform, leaning against a railing overlooking the tracks. My flashlight flicked over the rails, the ties, the walls lined with peeling posters and water stains. I imagined the trains that once thundered through here, the voices of passengers, the footsteps of conductors. Now there was only silence, but it was a living silence, full of weight, full of memory, full of watching. The dripping continued, echoing along the tunnels, punctuating the stillness. I held my flashlight steady, feeling the pressure of the darkness, the silence, the knowledge that someone or something had left traces for me to find. Rust and decay carried stories here, stories of lives interrupted, of secrets preserved in concrete and steel. And I realized with a slow, sinking certainty that this station would not let me leave unchanged. I retraced my steps toward the entrance, careful not to disturb anything more than necessary. Every footprint I left in the dust felt like a record, another mark that the station would remember. The metal door at the alley's edge seemed both inviting and threatening, a threshold between this quiet, patient underground world and the city above, bright and indifferent. I paused at the door, hand on the handle, and glanced back into the shadows. The tunnel stretched endlessly, the dripping echoing softly, a reminder that silence here was never empty. The walls seemed to watch, the rust seemed to breathe, the posters seemed to whisper faintly in my mind. I left the station slowly, deliberately, carrying the memory of its silence, its weight, and its hidden stories with me. Even now, when I walk past that alley during the day, the door seems to pulse with the same quiet insistence, as if the station remembers me, as if it waits. Rust and silence have a way of holding onto those who wander too carefully, those who notice too much. And I know I will return, if only because the station has left something behind in my mind, patient, watching, and unyielding. The deeper we went into the subway tunnels, the heavier the air became. It wasn't just damp or stale, though it carried both. There was something else, a quiet weight pressing in from all sides, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. My flashlight flicked across the walls, illuminating the cracked tiles, the rusted beams, and the occasional puddle reflecting the faint, wavering light. Every sound echoed in the tunnels, the drip of water, the distant hum of the city far above, the scrape of our own boots on concrete. But beneath it all, I felt it, something watching. It was on the curve of the next corridor that we found it, a platform unlike the others, partially sealed by yellowed police tape, frayed and hanging loosely from rusted hooks. It blocked the end of the tunnel. Graffiti covered every surface, messages scribbled in black marker and spray paint, some simple, some jagged and chaotic. Most of it was just the typical scrawls of bored vandals, but some lines made my stomach tight. They never left. Do not step here. I can still see them. I crouched slightly, shining the flashlight along the edge of the tape. The platform had long been unused, the tiles cracked and stained, the tracks coated in a thin layer of dust. My pulse quickened, slow and deliberate as I stepped closer. There was an undeniable sense of wrongness here, a residue of something unresolved, something that had been left behind deliberately, intentionally. As I moved along the edge, I noticed faint marks in the dust, footprints perhaps, but not quite human. They were long and narrow, uneven, pressed lightly into the grime. I followed them with my flashlight beam, careful not to disturb anything. The prints led to a corner where the platform curved into shadow, curling around a pile of debris and broken benches. Graffiti here was different. Not random words or names, but phrases that seemed meant for someone like me, someone who would notice, who would walk too carefully, who would think too deeply. They watch when you think you are alone. Eyes in the dark see more than light ever will. The letters were jagged, hurried, almost frantic. I traced one with my finger, feeling the rough concrete beneath my skin, and I imagined the person who had written it. Fearful, desperate, aware of being seen, and powerless to stop it. The shadows seemed to shift as I moved, curling along the walls, stretching longer than they should, bending at impossible angles. I could feel the weight of eyes pressing from those corners, patient, deliberate, unseen. My breath slowed as I tried to steady myself. This was a place abandoned by the city above, yes, but not by what lingered in the darkness below. Something had remained hidden, patient, waiting for attention. I stepped onto the edge of the platform, careful to avoid the dust and debris. The air was colder here, heavier, almost metallic in its taste. I imagined the trains that had run through this station decades ago, the people who had waited here, the lives that had passed through without leaving more than a faint imprint. And then I imagined the platform as it had been the day it was sealed. Police tape strung across it, lights extinguished, warnings posted, evidence left behind of something that shouldn't be forgotten. The graffiti seemed to pulse in the flashlight beam. I couldn't read it all in one glance. Some of the messages were layered over each other, old and new, forming a chaotic map of fear. Names, dates, warnings, fragments of sentences. One message repeated itself. The eyes never close. They are always here. I swallowed, feeling a shiver rise along my spine. I couldn't tell if the fear belonged to the writer or if it was mine, inherited from the place itself. I moved slowly along the platform, flashlights sweeping every corner. There were benches, rusted and broken, leaning against the wall. A few discarded papers fluttered in the draft, old newspapers yellowed with age, pages brittle. One article caught my eye, a brief mention of a crime decades ago, a missing person whose trail ended at the station. The words were faded, but the meaning was clear. Someone had vanished here and the station had kept it secret. I crouched to examine another message on the wall. Do not look behind you. The letters were jagged, scratched deep into the concrete. My hand trembled slightly as I traced them. My mind conjured shapes in the darkness behind me, shadowed figures that didn't exist, or did they? I told myself to breathe, slow and steady, feeling the cold metal of the railing beneath my fingers, grounding myself. The shadows in the far corner shifted again. I blinked, unsure if it was fatigue or reality. A long, thin shape stretched across the wall, curling at the edges, retreating when I shone the flashlight directly on it. It felt deliberate, aware, like a patient observer hiding just out of reach. My chest tightened, the air growing heavier, pressing against me from all sides. I took a careful step forward, following the curve of the platform. Another message on the wall caught my attention. They know you are here. Leave before it sees. I froze, flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. I told myself it was just words, paint on concrete, graffiti meant to scare. But the atmosphere told me otherwise. The weight in the air, the subtle shifting of shadows, the sense of being observed. It was real, patient, and deliberate. The platform stretched farther than I expected, the end lost in darkness. The police tape was frayed, rusted hooks hanging loosely, swaying gently as if moved by something unseen. I shone the flashlight along the edge, noticing more discarded items. A small rusted suitcase, a torn jacket, a pair of gloves. Each object seemed to have been left carefully, deliberately, marking the platform with traces of lives once here, warnings left for anyone who came after. I paused in the middle of the platform, listening. The dripping water echoed faintly from the tunnels behind me, distant but insistent. The metallic echoes of the rails whispered under the weight of my boots. And then I felt it, something patient, deliberate, watching from the darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. I couldn't see it, couldn't name it, but its awareness pressed against me, slow and inescapable. I walked toward the end of the platform, each step measured, deliberate. The messages grew more urgent, more desperate. Do not linger. Do not turn. My flashlight trembled slightly as I moved past them. I tried to keep my focus on the concrete, the debris, anything tangible. But the shadows seemed to bend, curling at the edges of the light, stretching in ways that shouldn't be possible. At the very end of the platform, the tracks disappeared into darkness. I could see where the ceiling sloped downward, tunnel walls pressing close. The air was thick, heavy with dust, rust, and something else. Something faint but unmistakable. A metallic tang that made my stomach tighten. I imagined the people who had vanished here, the lives interrupted, and the presence that had waited quietly in the corners. I stepped back, flashlight sweeping the platform again, tracing every bench, every stain, every scrawled message. The air pressed closer, the shadows stretching longer, curling in ways that almost felt like fingers. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The station had a memory, and I had become part of it just by noticing, just by paying attention. I turned slowly, flashlight tracing the edge of the police tape, the frayed yellow barrier that separated the platform from the tunnel beyond. Every instinct told me to leave, to retreat, to step back into the normalcy of the city above. And yet, part of me lingered, drawn by curiosity, by the need to understand what had happened here, what the platform had witnessed, and what still lingered in its shadows. I stepped back toward the stairwell, careful not to disturb anything. The dripping water echoed again, long and hollow, and the metallic hum of distant rails vibrated faintly through the floor. I could still feel eyes on me, patient and deliberate, unseen but aware. I reminded myself to breathe, slow and steady, letting the air fill my lungs. As we made our way back toward the exit, the shadows seemed to shift once more, curling at the edges, retreating just slightly but never gone entirely. The graffiti, the police tape, the abandoned items, they were all remnants of something deeper, something persistent, something that lingered long after the people above had forgotten. And I knew with a quiet certainty that the platform would wait for the next person who dared to notice, patient and deliberate, unseen but always aware. The further we moved into the tunnel beyond the forgotten platform, the heavier the air became. It wasn't just damp or cold. It carried a quiet weight, as if the darkness itself had substance. Each step on the cracked concrete echoed, soft but insistent, bouncing back from the walls in long, hollow reverberations. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then the whispers started, soft, faint, almost like the hiss of air through pipes, but deliberate, patient, always just behind me. I stopped and listened. The sound seemed to shift with me, following my movements, retreating when I paused, rising subtly when I moved. I told myself it was my imagination, that the long hours underground and the fatigue from walking through stale air were playing tricks on me. But every instinct in my body insisted it was something else, something aware, something patient. The flashlight's beam swept along the walls, catching jagged patches of peeling paint, streaks of rust, and faint stains. Then I noticed the scratches, thin, long, and deliberate. At first glance, they looked like marks from old maintenance equipment or perhaps the claws of rodents, but the pattern didn't match anything natural. They were arranged like footprints, irregular, uneven, some deep, some barely noticeable. They weren't human. They couldn't be. Each set seemed to move alongside the wall, as if a parallel being had walked here, just out of sight, invisible to my eyes but leaving a trace of presence. I swallowed hard, the metallic tang of fear settling in my mouth. My heart began a slow, steady rhythm that somehow made the tunnel feel even larger, more oppressive. I took another step, flashlight sweeping the floor and walls, trying to convince myself that nothing could follow me. But the whispers persisted, faint syllables I couldn't quite understand, voices that weren't mine, words that seemed both warning and taunt. I crouched to examine the scratches. They ran along the wall at uneven intervals like a record of movement. Some began low near the floor, then angled up, stretching impossibly high before fading into the shadows above. I traced them with a finger, feeling the rough concrete, the rust, the age of the tunnel. I tried to convince myself they were old, remnants of decades past, but the pattern was too deliberate, too recent, too aware of where I was walking. The whispers grew slightly louder as I moved forward, pressing closer. They didn't form words, not entirely. Just soft hisses, syllables repeated in cycles, echoing in the darkness. I began to imagine shapes at the edges of the flashlight beam, long shadows curling, shifting, receding whenever I tried to focus on them. My chest tightened. My steps slowed. I felt exposed, observed, as if the tunnel itself were alive, aware, keeping count of my movements. A discarded backpack lay near the wall, tattered and dust-covered. I moved to inspect it, careful not to disturb anything else. Inside, I found nothing but a few empty notebooks, pages yellowed with age. Some were blank, others contained hurried notes, dates, names, fragments of sentences. One entry made my pulse spike. "It follows me. I can't leave. I don't know if I ever will." The handwriting was jagged, frantic, a record of fear left behind, a warning perhaps for anyone who dared walk this tunnel. I placed the notebook back carefully and continued. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the end hidden in shadow. Every step forward amplified the whispers, soft and steady, circling around me, curling into corners, slipping along the walls. I realized I couldn't hear footsteps behind me, but I felt them. The pressure of presence, patient and deliberate, moved with me, just out of sight, just out of reach. I approached a junction where the tunnel split. One path descended, the other curved sharply into darkness. I paused, listening to the whispers. They were louder down the left path, more urgent, insistent. Something in my chest told me to turn away, to retreat, but curiosity anchored me in place. The weight of the tunnel pressed closer, the whispers curling around me like smoke, subtle but persistent. I chose the descending path. The steps were uneven, coated in dust, each footprint I left marking my passage in the thick layer of grime. The walls here were scarred more heavily. Deep scratches ran along the sides, some resembling hands, some resembling feet, none human, none complete. They twisted at impossible angles, following a pattern I couldn't discern, leading me further into darkness. The whispers now seemed to respond to my movements. When I paused, they faded slightly, like a conversation held at a distance. When I moved, they rose again, soft but insistent. I tried to speak aloud to reassure myself, but my voice felt swallowed by the tunnel, absorbed into the shadows. I realized that no matter what I did, I was never alone here. Something unseen observed every gesture, every breath, every glance. The air grew colder still, carrying a faint metallic scent, mingled with damp concrete and mildew. I shone my flashlight along the walls, noting more graffiti, cryptic messages, initials, dates. Some just symbols I didn't recognize. One scratched line caught my eye. "Do not stop. It waits." My hands tightened around the flashlight and I forced my feet to move, slow, deliberate steps, keeping my eyes forward, avoiding the corners where the shadows pooled thickest. I noticed a faint pattern in the dust on the floor. Footprints, or something like footprints, interlaced with the scratches on the walls. The shape was long and thin, sometimes stretching into the walls, sometimes curling along the edges. I stopped and crouched to examine them. They weren't human, not entirely. The depth, the spacing, the angles, they suggested a being that moved deliberately, aware of every step I took. A record of someone or something, following a path alongside me just out of sight. A soft metallic clink echoed from deeper in the tunnel. I froze. The flashlight trembled slightly in my hands. The sound was faint but precise, deliberate, as if something had moved an object just beyond my reach. My heart thumped slowly, every beat resonating through my chest. I reminded myself to breathe, slow and steady, letting the rhythm calm me. The tunnel was patient. I was its visitor. The longer I stayed, the more it marked me. I continued, each step measured, deliberate, following the twisted path of the scratches, the faint footprints, the whispers that seemed to swirl and coil around me. I imagined the people who had been here before, the lives interrupted, the fear recorded in the concrete and rust. And I felt the weight of all of them pressing against me, patient, deliberate, unseen. At a sharp turn in the tunnel, I saw what looked like a small alcove. My flashlight swept over it, revealing a pile of discarded items, a torn coat, a rusted toolbox, scraps of paper. One piece had writing I could barely make out. "It never leaves. It follows, always." I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. The whispers rose subtly, curling closer, brushing against my ears, pressing into my thoughts. I realized then that the tunnel had a memory. It held traces of everything that had passed through, recorded in scratches, in dust, in abandoned items. And now I was part of it, leaving footprints, leaving sound, leaving evidence of my presence. The whispers seemed to recognize me, circling and retreating, rising and falling with each movement. I paused, flashlight resting on the wall. The scratches seemed to stretch higher, curling at impossible angles, and the faint impressions on the floor led further into darkness. My chest tightened, every breath deliberate, aware. I could sense the patience in the tunnel, the observation, the awareness. I told myself to turn back, to leave, but a part of me wanted to see how far it extended, how deep it went, what secrets it kept hidden. The whispers seemed to grow more insistent, as though urging me forward, guiding me along the path. I kept moving, step by step, the scratches on the walls marking the route, the faint footprints on the floor guiding me deeper. Every so often, I would glance over my shoulder, expecting to see something, anything, but there was only darkness, patient and deliberate. When I finally stopped, exhausted and tense, I realized that I had walked farther than I had intended. The tunnel stretched endlessly ahead, the shadows curling along the edges, the whispers circling, soft but persistent. The scratches on the walls continued into the darkness, footprints following them, unseen but aware. I knew then that the tunnel had claimed me as it had claimed others, that the whispers, the marks, the memory of fear would follow me long after I left. I turned slowly, retracing my steps back toward the sealed platform, the flashlight sweeping over the walls one last time. The whispers receded slightly, but they were still there, patient and deliberate, echoing in my mind. I left the alcove behind, leaving the items untouched, leaving the scratches as records, leaving my own presence as a mark for the next visitor. Even as I finally emerged back onto the platform, the station above seemed unreal, distant, quiet in a different way. But the tunnel remained alive in my thoughts, patient and deliberate, carrying the whispers, the scratches, the footprints, and the weight of all those who had walked before me. I knew I would not forget, and I knew that the tunnel would not forget me either. We had been moving through the tunnels for what felt like hours, the whispers still circling, soft and patient, never fully gone. Every step echoed back at us in long, hollow vibrations, and the scratches along the walls seemed to reach further than before, curling higher, stretching farther, marking paths we weren't meant to follow. I thought we were careful, disciplined in our exploration, but the station had its own rhythm, its own patience, and it was leading us somewhere slowly, deliberately. It was when we turned a corner near a bend in the old track that we saw it. The faint gleam of metal, a long shadow stretching toward us, illuminated by no lights of our own making. At first, I thought it was one of the abandoned trains, rusted and forgotten, sitting in place for decades. But it moved. Slowly, impossibly, as if gliding along rails that hadn't felt a train in decades. Its shape was indistinct, the edges blurred by shadows, but the presence was undeniable. I froze, flashlight shaking slightly in my grip. My companions whispered nervously behind me, their voices catching in low tones, almost swallowed by the tunnel. The train, or whatever it was, seemed to breathe, a weight pressing into the tunnel itself. There was no sound beyond the soft hum of movement, no clatter of wheels, no grinding of metal. Yet I felt the pressure, the certainty that it was real, that it was aware of us. We stepped backward slowly, trying to retreat, our boots scraping against the concrete. The train glided closer, impossibly silent, a phantom in the darkness. I could see glimpses of the interior through faint gaps in the shadow. Empty seats, old advertisements curling with age, shadows pooling in the corners as if they were waiting. The air grew colder, thicker, each breath tasting metallic, carrying the faintest hint of decay and damp steel. My companions urged me forward, whispering for me to keep moving. I wanted to comply, wanted to step out of the darkness and leave the station behind. But part of me lingered, unable to turn my gaze away. There was something about the train, about the way it carried its own awareness, that pressed into my mind. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a record, a presence, a remnant of everything that had been abandoned here, everything that had waited in silence for years. I took another step, and the whispers rose slightly, circling my ears, soft but deliberate. They didn't form words, just syllables repeated in faint patterns, brushing against my thoughts. I realized with a creeping chill that the station itself was aware of me, aware of us, and that the train was part of that awareness, a vessel carrying something patient and deliberate. The train glided past, impossibly close. I could feel a current of air, cold and heavy, brushing my face. I caught a glimpse of the doors opening and closing silently, empty, yet inviting, as if it could take me in, carry me deeper into the station, into shadows I was not meant to see. My pulse quickened, slow but insistent, each beat echoing in my chest. I wanted to step away, to flee, but my feet felt weighed down, reluctant to leave this impossible presence behind. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the train vanished. There was no grinding halt, no screech of metal, no fatting whistle. It simply receded into the shadows, leaving only the lingering hum of the tunnel, the whispers, and a profound sense of absence that pressed into my mind. My flashlight trembled slightly, catching the walls and floor, the familiar scratches now seeming sharper, more deliberate, as if marking our passage. We fled then, hurrying back through the tunnels toward the sealed platform, our footsteps loud in the oppressive silence. The whispers followed us, circling, retreating slightly but never fully gone. Every turn, every shadow seemed heavier, filled with expectation. I tried to convince myself that the train had been a trick of light and shadow, a memory of long-forgotten rails, but the cold pressure of presence told me otherwise. Something had moved here, something aware, and it had been interested in us. When we finally emerged back onto the platform, the weight of the station seemed to lift slightly, but not entirely. The graffiti, the police tape, the abandoned items, they were all reminders that the station had memory, and that memory was patient. It remembered us now. I could feel it in the dust on the floor, in the scratches on the walls, in the echoes that lingered long after our footsteps faded. Outside, the city was alive and indifferent. Cars passed, people walked. The hum of normal life filling the streets. Yet as I stepped into the open air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed. The train was gone, yes, vanished into shadows, but the presence that had ridden it, the awareness that had watched us, had not. I could feel it in my chest, in my thoughts, patient and deliberate. It lingered, unseen but unmistakable, as if part of the station had stepped into the world above, carrying its weight with it. I kept walking, trying to ignore the chill crawling along my spine. The city above was bright and noisy, yet every shadow seemed darker, every alleyway longer, every reflection in glass or puddle slightly distorted. I imagined the whispers, faint now, brushing against my ears even outside the station, reminding me that the boundaries had shifted. Something patient had left the tunnels, had followed, and would wait for the next opportunity to remind me. That night in my apartment far from the station, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building, every distant siren, every soft hum of the city reminded me of the station, of the vanishing train, of the presence that lingered. Shadows seemed to stretch along the walls, subtle but deliberate, curling in corners where light didn't reach. I knew it had followed, that the station's awareness had not ended at the edge of the tunnel. It was patient, deliberate, unseen, but very real. Even now, when I close my eyes, I see the shape of the train gliding silently along the abandoned rails, doors opening and closing without sound, a shadow moving with purpose. The whispers return, soft and insistent, circling in my mind. The scratches, the footprints, the weight of the station, all of it remains, a record of presence that I carry with me. And I know with a quiet, sinking certainty that it will not let me forget, not entirely. The city seems normal, indifferent, but I can feel the station everywhere. In the subway tunnels I pass in daylight, in the reflections of glass doors, in the faint drafts that sweep along alleyways. It waits patiently, deliberate and unseen, carrying the memory of the vanishing train, the whispers and the scratches. I cannot say if it follows everyone, or if it chose me specifically. But I know that part of the station has left the underground world behind and moved into mine, a silent witness, patient and aware, lingering just beyond perception. And so I walk, careful, deliberate, aware that some presence accompanies me now, unseen but undeniable, patient and waiting, as if the vanishing train had never truly disappeared. The library was quieter at night than I had imagined it could ever be. The hum of the air conditioning, the faint scrape of my shoes on the polished floor, even the soft turning of pages, all of it felt amplified as though the building were listening. I had worked the night shift for months, yet I never grew used to the way the darkness changed the space, how shadows pooled in corners, stretching along the shelves like slow, patient fingers. I was shelving returned books when I noticed it for the first time. A thin, folded piece of paper tucked between the pages of a worn mystery novel. The paper was yellowed, edges frayed, and the handwriting inside was hurried, jagged, but deliberate. I unfolded it carefully, almost afraid to disturb what had been hidden for decades. I watched her from the window. She never knew. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made me pause. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, but the library was empty, silent except for my own breathing. My pulse slowed, steadying itself as I reminded myself that I was alone, that these were just notes someone had left behind long ago. Curiosity pulled me further. I began checking the books more carefully, flipping through pages, looking for anything else out of place. I found more folded notes, some tucked inside textbooks, others wedged between novels with torn spines. Each one recounted fragments of crimes, stories of people missing or found under mysterious circumstances, as if the writer had been a witness, or worse, a participant. One note read, "The man in the brown coat comes at night. No one believes me. I hear him in the halls, always near the stacks." I shivered and placed the note carefully back between the pages. The handwriting varied, some neat, some frantic, some almost childlike. It didn't matter. All of them carried the same feeling. Someone watching, someone present, even when no one else could see. I began to sense it then, the subtle weight of attention, a quiet presence in the space around me. I told myself it was only imagination, the brain filling the gaps in the empty library, but the sensation persisted. Shelves that were usually harmless now seemed to lean slightly, shadows stretching along the floor, lingering near the corners where the fluorescent light barely reached. I felt eyes on me, patient and deliberate, though I knew no one was there. Hours passed. I moved slowly, deliberately, running my fingers along the spines of books, checking the notes for any pattern. Some of the diaries were small, barely larger than my palm, the pages filled with dates, observations, and cryptic warnings. One diary recounted a missing woman, describing in detail how someone had followed her home, left marks in the hallway, and vanished before anyone could see. Another contained a list of locations, scribbled in haste, abandoned buildings, forgotten streets, and quiet parks where crimes had taken place without resolution. I felt my hands grow clammy as I read, the fluorescent lights above casting a pale, uneven glow over the shelves. The library was alive with its own memory, every book a keeper of secrets, every note a whisper from the past. The air seemed thicker, heavier, as though each story had left a residue, pressing against me, patient and deliberate. I wasn't just reading. I was walking among echoes, tracing the steps of lives interrupted, of crimes recorded but never resolved. A soft noise caught my attention, a subtle scraping like fingernails along the edge of a table. I froze, listening. The library was silent again. I told myself it was the building settling, or maybe the stack of chairs at the far end shifting under its own weight. But my skin prickled with awareness, and I felt compelled to check. I walked slowly toward the sound, my flashlight beam flicking across the polished floors and the rows of books. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. Yet the sensation remained. Someone, something present, waiting, patient, deliberate. I returned to the shelves, attempting to calm my thoughts, but I noticed new details I hadn't seen before. Small scratches along the wooden edges of the bookcases, faint fingerprints on dusty surfaces, pages slightly curled as if someone had been reading in secret. The library had a memory. It held the traces of those who had walked its halls, the fragments of lives that had intersected here and then disappeared. And now it held me. I picked up a heavy volume of local history, flipping carefully through the pages. A photograph fell out, brittle and yellow. It showed a man standing at the entrance of the library decades ago, his face partially obscured by shadows. There was something about the way he leaned against the doorway, patient, deliberate, as if waiting. My pulse quickened. I realized I had been watching the shadows, the corners, the shelves. But perhaps he had been watching me too, across time, through the very memory of the library. I spent the next hour moving from shelf to shelf, diary to diary, note to note. The whispers remained, soft and indistinct, brushing along my ears like wind through a narrow alley. They didn't form words, not entirely, just fragments, impressions, warnings. Do not linger. They know you are here. Someone watches. Each note, each scrap of paper seemed to carry the weight of attention, a consciousness that had lingered for decades. I found a small, leather-bound diary tucked between two encyclopedias. The pages were filled with detailed observations, people who came to the library and never returned for weeks, odd occurrences at night, shadows that moved independently, whispers in the corners. One entry read, "I feel it in the air around me in the books. Someone is always watching, even when I turn away." I traced the words with my finger, feeling the depression of the ink against the paper. The handwriting trembled slightly, as though the writer had been terrified, aware of something beyond comprehension. By then, the weight of the library pressed on me, a quiet but insistent presence in every corner. The stacks seemed taller, the shadows longer. Every sound, own breath, the rustle of a page, the faint hum of the lights was amplified in the stillness. I realized I had been here for hours, yet I had seen nothing move, yet I had felt the persistent gaze of something patient and deliberate, lingering just beyond the edge of perception. I decided to leave for a moment, stepping toward the exit. But as I walked past the shelves, I felt it again, eyes patient and deliberate following my every movement. A chill crawled along my spine, subtle, insistent. I wasn't imagining it. The library had a memory, and now it had noticed me. The notes, the diaries, the hidden messages, they were warnings, guides, and perhaps invitations. I paused at the doorway, looking back over my shoulder. Shadows clung to the shelves, curling around corners, lingering near the notes I had discovered. The whispers brushed the edge of my mind, faint but deliberate. I felt the weight of countless eyes, patient, deliberate, waiting for attention, observing my hesitation, cataloging my presence. I left the library slowly, carefully, carrying the sense of being watched with me. Even now, days later, I can feel it, the quiet weight of the library, the whispers in the corners of my mind, patient and deliberate. I've tried to forget the notes, the diaries, the eyes that seem to linger in the shadows. But every time I think of the quiet rows of books, the polished floors, the yellowed pages tucked into hidden corners, I remember. The library sees, the library remembers, and the library waits. I returned to the library that night with a sense of reluctance, as if I was walking back into a place that had already noticed me. The doors closed behind me with a muted click, and the familiar hush of the building welcomed me, but it was different now. The air seemed heavier, carrying a quiet pressure that pressed against my chest. I told myself it was only imagination, the memory of the notes and diaries lingering too vividly, but a part of me knew better. The first sound was almost imperceptible, a faint tap, tap, tap echoing somewhere far away across the polished floors, bouncing off the shelves. I froze, holding my breath, straining to locate it. It wasn't like the usual creaks of the building or the soft settling of air conditioning. It was deliberate, rhythmic, patient. Footsteps. Someone or something was walking the aisles. I called out softly, testing the emptiness. "Hello," my voice carried, swallowed quickly by the cavernous rows of books. No answer came. The echo of my own words seemed to stretch unnaturally, lingering longer than it should, folding into the shadows between the stacks. Yet the footsteps continued, faint, patient, always just beyond reach. I moved toward the sound, flashlight cutting narrow paths of light across the shelves. Books leaned precariously on the edges, and as I stepped closer, one fell with a soft thud, startling me despite my efforts to remain calm. I bent down and picked it up. The pages were yellowed, worn, familiar in their dusty scent, but the title was curious, Children of the City, Lost and Forgotten. I opened it, scanning quickly. A folded piece of paper slipped out. Unfolding it, I read the words written in a careful, almost meticulous hand. She disappeared at the corner near the fountain. No one saw, no one noticed, but I did. A chill ran down my spine. The library had kept the memory, the fragments, the warnings. The footsteps grew louder, yet still distant, circling around me like a soft rhythm only I could hear. I moved down the aisle slowly, deliberately, scanning the shelves. Books were beginning to fall on their own, not violently but softly, as if nudged by invisible hands. They formed patterns, lines on the floor, gaps in the shelves, and as I traced them, I realized the alignment was deliberate. The fallen books pointed toward a section I had rarely visited, the back corner of the library, where older records and fragile manuscripts were stored. The closer I got, the more the footsteps seemed to echo from every direction. They were faint, almost polite, but unmistakable. I tried to ignore them, telling myself the sound was carried by the ventilation, bouncing off shelves, or simply the creaks of the building. But my skin prickled, every nerve alert. I could feel presence. Patient, deliberate, aware. I reached the corner. The books on the floor had formed a crude arrow, pointing toward a small, low shelf I hadn't paid much attention to before. The whispers of paper brushing together seemed to grow louder here, a soft sighing sound, almost conversational. I bent down, brushing my fingers over the spines. One book was particularly worn, a small diary with a cracked leather cover. The handwriting inside was delicate, careful, yet filled with fear. I saw him take her, the boy by the fountain. He hides in shadows. No one believes me. I hide in the library, hoping someone will notice. I shivered. The footsteps seemed to slow, circling closer, echoing softly as if aware of what I had read. I held the diary to my chest, heart pounding in slow, measured beats, and scanned the surrounding shelves. Shadows clung to the edges, curling around corners, pooling beneath the tall stacks. I told myself it was just fatigue, my imagination feeding on old notes and diaries, but the feeling of being watched refused to leave. Books continued to fall in soft, deliberate patterns. I noticed that the gaps they left spelled something faint, almost imperceptible from where I stood. Follow. The letters formed in the arrangement of the fallen tomes, subtle, deliberate. It wasn't the handwriting on the pages. It was the space they left behind. The library itself seemed to be guiding me, patient and deliberate, pushing me toward the stories that had been left hidden, unspoken, waiting. I walked slowly down the arrowed path, flashlight sweeping the shelves. The air grew colder, thicker, as if the space was compressing around me. I felt the presence move with me, soft and patient, circling the shadows, brushing along my arms and neck without touching, a weight in the corner of my mind. The footsteps had stopped, or perhaps they had merely synchronized with my own, mirroring each movement, impossible to distinguish. I reached a small table tucked beneath a high shelf, and atop it lay a bundle of notes tied with faded ribbon. I untied them carefully. Each sheet told a fragment of the same story. A child gone missing decades ago, a neighborhood too quiet to notice, a witness too afraid to speak. Each note carried the same tone, calm on the surface but layered with fear, the memory of the unknown pressing through every line. He watches in the stacks. He waits at night. Don't follow the sound, he knows you can hear him. I swallowed hard. My hands shook slightly, the diary trembling against my chest. The library was alive in its own quiet way, alive with memory, alive with observation. The footsteps had returned, circling again, faint but deliberate, moving across the floors where no one walked. I realized I was tracing someone else's path, walking along the edges of a story recorded in whispers, paper, and dust. I opened another book, a collection of local reports from decades past. A page fell out, brittle and yellowed. A photograph slipped with it, showing a small girl standing by a fountain, her expression solemn, eyes fixed on the camera, though I could imagine she was already aware someone was watching her. My pulse slowed, but the presence remained, patient, deliberate. It lingered, circling, whispering without words. I traced my fingers over the photograph, feeling the impressions of old paper. The footsteps continued softly, echoing in the empty aisles, faint but impossible to ignore. I could sense them moving around me, responding to my movements, a rhythm that wasn't mine. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my thoughts, trying to convince myself this was only imagination. But the pattern of fallen books, the whispered pages, the faint footfalls, they were deliberate. They had meaning. As I pieced together the fragments, I realized the library was not just a collection of books. It was a witness. Every note, every diary, every fallen page was evidence of the unseen, of those who had been watched, of lives interrupted and stories left unfinished. And now it watched me, patient, deliberate, waiting to see if I would follow the traces, if I would listen to the whispers, if I would uncover what it had stored in silence for so long. I gathered the fallen books, stacking them carefully, but I left the diary and the notes where they were. Some records, some memories, I decided, were meant to remain untouched, waiting for the next visitor, the next witness to notice them. The footsteps had ceased again, leaving only a quiet pressure in the air, the sense that I was being observed even when nothing moved. As I walked toward the exit, I glanced back at the corner where the notes had been. Shadows clung there still, curling against the edges of the shelves, patient, deliberate. The library held its secrets, and it held me in its memory. I could feel the story lingering in my mind, the soft footsteps echoing in the empty aisles, patient, deliberate, waiting for someone else to notice, someone else to follow. Even after leaving the library that night, the presence remained. Faint footfalls in the distance, shadows stretching a little too long, the feeling of being observed in quiet corners of my apartment. It followed me, patient and deliberate. The child, the missing stories, the notes and diaries, they had left a mark, and I knew with quiet certainty that the library's memory would not release me easily. It was a few nights later when I found the door. I don't remember ever noticing it before. The narrow, unmarked door at the back of the library, tucked between two shelves of dusty journals and local newspapers. Something about that night made me notice it. The quiet pressure in the air, the faint brush of movement from the shadows, almost as if the library was nudging me, directing me to something it had kept hidden for decades. The handle was cold to the touch, slick under my fingers, and the door opened with a reluctant creak that echoed down the long hallway behind it. Inside, the room was small and dim, the faint light from the library spilling in through a high window. Dust hung in the air, shimmering in the narrow beam of my flashlight, and the smell of old paper and chalk filled the space. There was no furniture, except for a single wooden chair and a chalkboard on the far wall. I stepped inside carefully, my boots muffled on the worn floorboards. The air was colder here, heavier, carrying a quiet weight that pressed against my chest. The chalkboard drew my gaze immediately. Words were scrawled across it in large, uneven letters, some faded almost to invisibility, others freshly marked, as though someone had been writing here recently. I moved closer, feeling the cold settle deeper into my bones. The words chilled me. I shouldn't have taken her. I shouldn't have been alone with her. They'll never forgive me. I watched and did nothing. I could have stopped it. I should have stopped it. He isn't gone. He watches still. I can hear him. I swallowed hard. My hands shook slightly as I traced the words with my fingertips, feeling the impressions left in the chalk. The confessions were fragmented, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. Someone, maybe many someones, had left pieces of their guilt here in this hidden room where no one else would find them. And yet, somehow, I had. A subtle whisper stirred behind me, soft and nearly imperceptible. I froze, heart beating slowly but steadily, listening. It wasn't the hum of the air conditioning, nor the settling of the building. It was deliberate, patient, curling along the walls, brushing against my ears. The library had drawn me here, and now I could feel the presence fully, cold and patient, pressing against the back of my neck, lingering in the corners of the room where my flashlight didn't reach. I moved around the small space slowly, deliberately, scanning the floor, the walls, and the corners. Dust shifted faintly under my feet, though there was no wind, no disturbance. A chair rocked slightly as I passed, just a subtle movement enough to make my stomach tight. I reminded myself to breathe slow, steady breaths, but the whispering seemed to slip under my skin, curling around my thoughts, insistent, patient, deliberate. The chalkboard called to me again, and I realized there was more than one layer of writing. Beneath the confessions, older words peeked through faintly. Names, dates, cryptic notes about missing people, observations of shadows, and warnings not to linger. I squinted, tracing them with my finger. Each line carried the weight of memory, guilt, and secrecy, fragments of lives intersecting with this room in ways I could not fully comprehend. A soft tap echoed from the back of the room. I spun slowly, flashlight trembling in my grip. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, and yet the whispering shifted, circling, patient and deliberate. It wasn't a voice exactly. It was more like fragments, impressions, syllables brushing along the edge of thought. He waits. Don't look behind you. She remembers. I swallowed hard and forced myself to look away, though my eyes kept returning to the chalkboard. Each confession, each scrawled warning seemed to layer on top of the others, building a history I could almost feel pressing against the walls. The room itself felt aware, patient, deliberate. It had been holding these secrets for decades, gathering fragments of memory, fragments of guilt, fragments of lives that no one had acknowledged. And now it had noticed me. I stepped closer to the board and read another line, freshly written. They always come back. I see them in the stacks. I hear them in the whispering. The words resonated in my chest, aligning with the faint footfalls I had heard the previous nights, with the fallen books, with the notes about the missing child. The library's memory was alive here, compacted into this hidden room, whispering, observing, waiting. I could feel the presence circling the edges of the walls, patient and deliberate, as if measuring me, cataloging me, recording my attention. I tried to leave, to step back toward the door, but my feet felt heavy, reluctant to obey. The air had grown colder still, pressing down on my shoulders, weighing against my chest. My flashlight flickered slightly, and for a moment, shadows pooled in the corners, dark and slow-moving, curling toward me. I reminded myself that there was nothing there, no one. Yet every instinct, every shiver of awareness, screamed that the room itself was alive with attention. A faint draft brushed along my neck, carrying with it the scent of old paper, dust, and something faintly metallic. I shivered and looked around. The shadows hadn't moved, at least not visibly, but the feeling remained, patient, deliberate, aware. The whispering intensified slightly, gentle syllables circling the edges of my mind. Do not leave, do not forget. Watch, remember, follow. I realized then that the room was not just a hiding place. It was a witness. It had stored these confessions, these memories, these fragments of guilt, because someone had needed them to be remembered. And now I had found them. I could feel the weight of attention pressing in, patient and deliberate, an awareness that stretched beyond the chalkboard, beyond the shadows, and into me. I moved toward the door, slow, deliberate, trying to calm my racing mind. But even as I stepped into the hallway, the whispering seemed to follow, curling along my ears, brushing lightly against my thoughts. The hidden room had marked me. I could feel it lingering, patient, deliberate, observing, even as I walked back into the larger, familiar library space. For the rest of my shift, I moved carefully, scanning shelves and corners, aware that the presence had not left. It was patient, deliberate, curling around the rows of books, hovering in the shadows, waiting. I tried to focus on the mundane, shelving books, organizing returns, checking the notes I had previously found. But every step carried the faint, lingering awareness of the whispering room, its chalkboard confessions etched into my mind, its patient gaze following me through the aisles. When I finally stepped outside into the cool night air, the city seemed ordinary again. Streetlights glimmered, distant traffic hummed, and people walked by unaware. And yet, in the quiet corners of my mind, I could still hear it. The whispering, patient, deliberate circling, pressing. The room had not released me. It had followed me, folded into my thoughts, reminding me that some places remember, that some presences endure, that the library holds what we cannot see, what we do not speak of, what lingers long after the doors close. I went home that night with the feeling that the chalkboard had imprinted on me, patient and deliberate. Shadows in my apartment stretched a little too long. Sounds carried longer than they should, subtle, almost conversational. I could feel the room waiting, watching, whispering. And I knew deep down that it would always be there in memory, patient, deliberate, lingering just beyond perception, guiding my thoughts, marking me as someone who had seen too much, who had listened too carefully, who had been observed. Even now, when I close my eyes, I see the chalkboard, faint letters bleeding through the darkness. I hear the whispers, soft and patient, circling, deliberate, insistent. The room is quiet, but it is aware. It remembers, it watches, it waits. And I cannot unhear, cannot unsee, cannot leave behind the weight of its memory. The streets were quieter than usual that night, a lull that made every sound seem louder, sharper, more deliberate. My footsteps echoed off the narrow walls of the alleyways as I made my way home, carrying nothing but my jacket and a sense of routine. I had walked this path hundreds of times before, a shortcut through the older part of the city, where the streetlights were dim, and the buildings leaned close, their bricks soaked with years of rain and neglect. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. The graffiti. I had seen it before, of course, tags and scrawls, the usual mix of political slogans, gang symbols, and names. But tonight something caught my eye. A name etched in black paint, slightly smudged, staring back at me from a brick wall. Mine. Not exactly, not fully, but unmistakably enough to make my stomach tight. I stopped and stared, trying to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a coincidence. Perhaps it was someone with the same first name. But the letters felt deliberate, patient, deliberate. I continued walking, slower now, each step more cautious than the last. The alley seemed narrower than usual, shadows curling around the corners, pooling beneath the dim glow of the flickering streetlights. Every discarded bottle, every broken crate, every overturned trash can seem to carry intention, as though the alley itself had been waiting for me, marking a path I hadn't noticed before. At first, the graffiti appeared random, but as I moved deeper into the alley, patterns emerged. Names of people I didn't know, scribbled quickly but interspersed with odd phrases. "She knows too much. Watch your steps. Do not linger." A chill crept up my spine. I forced my pace, trying to convince myself that I was imagining patterns in random chaos, that the night and my nerves were conspiring to make me uneasy. An abandoned bicycle lay against a wall, the tires flat, the paint peeling. I walked past it, but something about it made me pause. A note was tucked into the handlebars, paper yellowed and curling. I didn't dare pick it up fully, only glanced at the words scrawled in a shaky hand. "You are being watched. Leave before it's too late." My pulse quickened, the air suddenly heavy, pressing against my chest. I swallowed hard and moved on, telling myself that someone was playing a prank, that the city had no consciousness, no memory, no intention. But the alley seemed to stretch longer than usual, corners bending impossibly, shadows thickening, folding over themselves. Each step brought new signs: a torn shoe lying by a doorway, a smudged handprint on a rusted dumpster, broken glass reflecting the faint light like fractured eyes. They weren't violent or threatening in themselves, but together they formed a story I didn't want to understand. A narrative whispered in silence, patient and deliberate, urging me to notice, to remember, to fear. I tried to focus on the familiar landmarks. An old bakery closed for the night, the corner shop with a shuttered window, but each one looked different under the dim light. Graffiti had appeared overnight, phrases, warnings, names. One wall read, "He knows your name." Another said, "Do not ignore the signs." My stomach twisted and I forced my pace, trying not to look over my shoulder, but the sensation of being observed clung to me. I passed a stack of abandoned crates near a fire escape. Something glittered among them. A small broken watch, face cracked, hands frozen at a time I didn't recognize. I bent down, fingertips brushing it, and the hairs on my neck stood on end. The alley was silent again, yet I could feel presence, patient, deliberate, just out of reach, circling in the corners of my vision. I left the watch where it lay, moving faster, though not recklessly. As I turned another corner, a series of posters, torn and curling, caught my attention. Faces of missing people stared from the walls, and beneath each was scrawled something more recent, a single word in messy handwriting. "Waiting. Remember. Here." My heart thumped loudly in my chest. The city, the alleyways, the walls, they weren't empty. They remembered. They noticed. They watched. I kept my flashlight low, beam narrow, illuminating only what was immediately in front of me. The alleys were a maze, but I knew the general direction home. Yet the path seemed to twist subtly, a small disorientation that made familiar turns feel unfamiliar, distant, deliberate. Every shadow held potential movement. Every sound, a dropped can, a distant cough, the soft scrape of boots on concrete, made me tense. Another discarded item caught my eye. A child's backpack torn at the seams, zipper half open. Inside, a small notebook. I paused, fingers brushing the fabric. The whisper of wind, or was it something else, stirred the notebook slightly. I looked inside, drawings, names, locations. And then a phrase scrawled clearly across the last page: "I am watching you." My stomach nodded. I tucked the notebook back inside, careful not to touch the words more than necessary, and quickened my pace. The city seemed to respond to me then. Shadows grew heavier, as though the walls leaned closer, narrowing the alley. Distant footsteps echoed behind me, though when I turned, the passage was empty. I told myself it was another passerby, a stray cat, or my own mind playing tricks. But the echo lingered, faint, rhythmic, patient. A narrow fire escape loomed above me. Rusted paint flacking, it seemed longer than memory served. I remembered reading about people leaving warnings in high places, messages in hidden nooks, subtle signs only noticed by those who passed frequently. I felt a sudden need to look up to see if something had been left there. And there it was, a small piece of paper wedged between the bars, edges torn. I reached for it, careful, fingers brushing against rough metal. On it, "Do not ignore what you see." I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my breathing. The city was ordinary, people walking home behind locked doors, lights flickering in apartments, cars moving lazily on distant streets. Yet the alleyways told a different story. They whispered of past events, of warnings left for no one in particular, of eyes that might follow, patient and deliberate, just out of reach. I passed another abandoned object, a broken umbrella caught in a fence, handle pointing like a finger. Beneath it, scrawled in faint chalk, "Last chance, turn back." I swallowed, heart thudding, legs moving faster. My familiar route home now felt like a gauntlet, each marker, each discarded object, each scribbled name a subtle warning. At last, the alley began to widen, opening into the quieter residential street where my apartment building waited. Yet even here, I felt the presence linger. The faint outlines of shadows clung to doorways, corners of windows, and alleys branching off into darkness. I shook my head, telling myself it was only imagination, fatigue, the city feeding on quiet minds. I reached my building, fumbling with keys, every sound amplified, the click of the lock, the faint hum of the hallway lights, the soft whisper of the wind through the open stairwell. Behind me, the alleyway remained, silent and patient, deliberate. I could almost feel the echoes of my footsteps lingering there, the eyes hidden in the graffiti and abandoned objects watching, waiting, remembering. Inside, the apartment was warm and still. The city noises faded behind the walls, and yet I could not shake the sensation of being observed, followed, marked. The names, the warnings, the objects left behind, they had chosen me, or perhaps I had chosen to notice them. Either way, I was part of the story now, woven into the fabric of these alleys, their patient, deliberate memories. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still see the graffiti flashing behind my eyes, the small abandoned objects forming a trail, the faint whispers curling in the corners of my mind. I tried to convince myself it was over, that I had walked home safely, that the city could not follow me beyond the walls. But deep down, I knew better. The alleys waited. They watched. And the next night, when the streets were quiet again, I would return to them in thought, if not in body, patient, deliberate, always observing. The night after my walk through the alleys, I could not shake the feeling that I had brought something back with me. Something small, patient, deliberate, and observing. I tried to convince myself it was imagination, the afterimage of graffiti and abandoned objects. But even as I moved through my apartment, I felt it in the corners of my vision, a shadow that lingered just beyond awareness. I decided to walk the same path again, partly out of curiosity, partly out of an unshakable need to understand why the alleyways seemed to be marking me. The city was quiet, quieter than usual, as if holding its breath, waiting. Streetlights flickered overhead, casting weak, intermittent pools of light that did little to break the darkness. I pulled my jacket tighter and began down the familiar route. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The alley was empty, as it always appeared during the late hours. But then I noticed movement, not clearly defined, just shifts in shadow, slight and deliberate. A garbage bag fluttered as if nudged by an unseen hand. A broken shutter clattered against its frame, though the wind was still. My pulse quickened, and I forced myself to slow my steps, to observe carefully. I reached the first wall I had noticed the night before, the one with the faint scrawl of my name. It was still there, faint in the dim light, and I felt a cold prickle crawl up my spine. Then, at the very edge of my vision, a flicker, A figure shifted in the darkness. I spun, but the alley remained empty. The movement was gone, yet the sense of being watched did not fade. I continued walking, keeping my eyes on the shadows, and soon I realized the movements were becoming more persistent. Not direct, not confrontational, but deliberate. Shapes seemed to linger just beyond the light, then recede when I looked directly at them. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest and neck, carrying with it the faint scent of damp brick and rusted metal, tinged with something I could not name. A soft scraping sound echoed from a side passage. I froze, straining to listen. There was nothing visible, nothing tangible, yet the sound repeated, deliberate, rhythmic, patient. I told myself it could be a stray cat, the settling of the building, a loose shutter swinging in the wind, but deep down I knew better. The alley was alive in its own way, remembering me, observing, waiting. I passed the abandoned bicycle again. The note from the previous night was gone, though the handlebars had been moved slightly, angled toward the shadows. My hands tightened around the strap of my bag. I quickened my pace, not recklessly but deliberately, trying to keep the sense of awareness under control. Every step seemed to echo unnaturally, bouncing off walls, lingering far longer than it should. A faint whisper of movement brushed past me, soft, delicate, like fingers tracing the edge of my jacket. I spun, flashlight slicing through the darkness. There was nothing, no one, yet I could feel it. Patient, deliberate, observing, a presence that moved with me without crossing into the light. My chest tightened. My heartbeat slowed, then quickened in irregular bursts, as though responding to something my eyes could not see. I reached the point where the alley opened into the side street leading toward my apartment. The street was empty, lit only by flickering lamps, but even here I sensed it lingering. Shadows pooled in corners, shifted beneath parked cars, brushed along the edges of doorways. And then I heard it, soft, barely audible footsteps behind me. Not my own echo, not the random rhythm of the city, but slow, deliberate, keeping pace with mine without drawing near. I stopped suddenly. The footsteps did too, my breath caught in my chest. I dared not turn. My body wanted to run, but I forced myself to stand still, listening. The sound began again, softer, circling around me, patient, deliberate, as if measuring my fear, observing my hesitation. I forced myself to keep moving, one cautious step at a time, toward my apartment building. The presence seemed to follow, circling in the darkness without revealing itself. My senses sharpened. Every rustle of paper, every drip from a gutter, every flicker of light became magnified, focused, deliberate. I could feel eyes tracing me, not human, not yet fully perceptible, patient and deliberate. When I reached the steps of my building, I glanced back. The alleyway appeared empty, silent, ordinary. And yet in my mind, I knew the movement had not ceased. I had not imagined the glimmers in the shadows, the faint brushing along my jacket, the rhythm of unseen footsteps. The city had marked me. The alleys had chosen me to notice. Inside my apartment, I tried to calm myself. I checked every corner, every window, every shadow, as though verifying reality could expel the presence. But it lingered, patient and deliberate in the quiet spaces, in the air between the walls, brushing along the edges of my thoughts. Every creak, every sigh of settling pipes, every distant hum of traffic seemed amplified, threaded with the sense of observation. That night I lay awake longer than usual, listening. At first, the city's distant noises were comforting. Then came the faintest echoes, scraping, shifting, soft movement in my mind's eye. I tried to convince myself it was memory, imagination, fatigue. But I could not deny it. The sense of being followed, watched, measured, lingered, patient, deliberate. Sleep arrived fitfully, and in my dreams the alley stretched longer than memory, shadows pooling and curling, figures just beyond perception, patient and deliberate, circling, observing. I awoke several times, convinced I heard the faint scrape of footsteps outside my window, the brush of shadow in corners of the room. Each time the room was empty. Each time the city was ordinary. And yet the presence persisted, patient and deliberate. A quiet, insistent reminder that I had been noticed, that the alleys remembered. For days after, I avoided the back streets when returning home. I took main roads, bright lights, the presence of other people. But even then, I felt it in quiet corners, felt the city remembering, observing. At night, I would glance toward my apartment windows, toward the alleyways, imagining faint movement, patient, deliberate. Sometimes I thought I saw shapes shift in the darkness, shadows curling around one another in impossible angles. And always there was the whisper of rhythm, a soft echo of footsteps that were never seen. I began to notice small signs elsewhere, discarded objects at the edges of streets, scraps of paper fluttering from doorways, graffiti that seemed newer, fresher, bearing names, initials, or fragments that resonated with memory. Each trace carried the same quiet, deliberate intent. Someone or something was marking me, observing, waiting. I tried to tell myself that it was paranoia, that the city was indifferent, and that my mind had woven patterns where none existed. But the rhythm was persistent, patient, and deliberate, woven into the night in ways that could not be denied. The footsteps had become part of the city's language, speaking to me in subtle shifts of shadow, in faint rustling of debris, in echoes that lingered after the sound itself had faded. And so I moved more carefully, eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, every flicker of light. My footsteps matched the rhythm of the alleyways, cautious, deliberate. The presence followed, patient, always just beyond my perception, circling, waiting. I could not see it, could not name it, but I knew it was there. I had walked these streets countless times before, familiar, ordinary. Now every late-night path, every quiet corner, every stretch of darkness carried memory, observation, and the quiet, deliberate insistence that I had been noticed. And I understood with a calm certainty that chilled me, that the city's eyes would follow me, patient and deliberate, for as long as I remained aware. The alleyways had grown stranger with each passing night. I tried to convince myself it was imagination, a mind overstimulated by shadows and graffiti, but the quiet persistence of movement, of presence, had begun to wear on me. That night I didn't plan to wander far, but the pull of the streets, their memory, their quiet insistence, led me again down the familiar route, past broken crates and discarded bottles, past walls scrawled with names, phrases, warnings. It was near the corner where the alley bent sharply that I noticed it. A narrow doorway, half hidden behind a stack of wooden pallets, the paint peeling so badly that the original color was nearly gone. I had passed this corner many times before and never noticed it, but now it called to me, patient, deliberate, as if waiting for someone who had finally learned to notice. The door was heavy, old, the hinges groaning softly when I pushed it open. A faint smell of dust, mildew, and rust greeted me, carried out like a warning. I paused, feeling the air shift around me, thick and cold. The narrow space beyond the door was dark, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the gloom. The walls were lined with old furniture, cabinets, chairs, tables, covered in layers of dust, as if untouched for decades. As I stepped inside, my senses sharpened. The air was alive with quiet echoes, the faintest whispers that seemed to originate from the walls themselves. I thought I heard movement, soft scraping. A chair shifted slightly under its own weight, though I was certain I had been careful not to disturb anything. The room seemed to breathe, patient and deliberate, holding its secrets close. I began to examine the furniture, moving slowly, deliberately. On a small table I found scraps of paper, yellowed and curled. Names, dates, phrases scrawled in careful, messy handwriting. Some were confessions, brief and chilling. Others were warnings. One note simply read, "Do not follow me." Another, "He will wait for you." My chest tightened. I tried to rationalize it. Someone had used this space long ago, hidden messages for reasons I could not know. But the sense of presence pressed in, patient and deliberate, as though the room itself watched me sift through its remnants. A dresser drawer creaked as I opened it, revealing old journals, their leather cracked and worn. I flipped through the pages, finding accounts of people who had come here, who had been watched, who had vanished without explanation. The handwriting was frantic in places, calm in others, but all carried the same quiet insistence. I am here. I see you. I am waiting. The room was heavy with memory. Every surface, every shadow, every layer of dust seemed charged, as if the walls remembered the footsteps, the whispered words, the presence of those who had come and gone. I felt a prickle along my spine, an awareness that I was not alone, though the air remained still. The shadows shifted slightly at the edges of my vision, patient, deliberate, never crossing fully into light, never revealing themselves. I moved deeper into the basement, flashlight tracing the contours of the space. A long table covered in papers and broken objects seemed to form a barrier separating me from the far wall. And on that wall, something caught my eye, a series of messages scrawled in chalk, bold and erratic. Names, phrases, warnings, all layered over one another. One word repeated in almost obsessive fashion: follow. Another, smaller, more delicate: don't stop. I swallowed, uneasy. The sense of being watched intensified. Every creak, every settling sound of old wood, every whisper of air seemed amplified, as though the room itself breathed around me. I tried to steady my thoughts, telling myself it was only memory, only shadows, only imagination. But the awareness of eyes, patient and deliberate, clung to me like a second skin. I noticed a small doorway at the far end of the basement, half obscured by a fallen bookshelf. Something about it made me pause. The space beyond was darker, more constricted, and the air felt heavier, charged with quiet insistence. I stepped closer, the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. The doorway seemed to lead downward, a set of steep, narrow stairs curling into darkness. I hesitated. My instincts urged me to retreat, to leave the room and the alley behind, but curiosity, a slow and deliberate curiosity, propelled me forward. Step by step, I descended, the air growing colder, heavier. The walls pressed in, damp and rough against my fingertips, and the faintest scent of decay, of something long forgotten, permeated the space. At the bottom, the basement widened slightly, revealing a collection of furniture I could not immediately identify. Chairs stacked haphazardly, cabinets with doors ajar, drawers pulled open as though disturbed recently. The air was thick, almost tactile, pressing against my skin. I felt a sudden awareness of being observed from every corner, every shadow. The presence was patient, deliberate, circling just beyond the reach of my flashlight, waiting for me to notice. I moved slowly, circling the room, flashlight beams sweeping across surfaces. On a table, I found a diary, its cover cracked and faded. Opening it revealed entries that spoke of someone always following, always watching. The handwriting trembled at times, calm at others. One line chilled me completely. Even when I leave, he waits. Always. I paused, the words echoing in my mind, feeling their weight in the air around me. The shadows seemed to react. A chair tipped slightly. A curtain of dust stirred from the floor, though no movement had disturbed it. I realized with a sinking certainty that the room, the basement, the alley, it had chosen to watch me. The objects were arranged subtly, deliberately, leaving signs that I could not fully understand. My own footsteps echoed back at me, mingling with the sense of another rhythm, another presence, circling patiently just out of sight. I noticed a wall with scratches, faint at first, then deeper, as though claws had been dragged across the surface. They did not resemble anything human. They were jagged, irregular, impossible to trace fully, and they led in a direction opposite the stairs I had descended. I followed them carefully, flashlight tracing the path, feeling my heart beat faster with each step. The scratches seemed almost deliberate, guiding me, warning me, drawing me further into awareness of what was watching. At the far end of the basement, I found another note, pinned to a broken chair with a rusty nail. The words were simple, yet carried a weight that made my skin crawl. "Do not look behind you." I froze, the beam of my flashlight swinging slowly over the room. Nothing moved visibly, yet I felt eyes on the back of my neck, patient, deliberate, circling. The sensation was not fear alone. It was anticipation, awareness, a quiet insistence that I had been noticed and would be remembered. I wanted to leave, to retrace my steps up the narrow stairs, out of the basement, out of the alley, out of the night entirely. But even as I turned, my mind traced every object, every shadow, every subtle sign left behind. The room held memory. It held intent. It had been prepared for someone to see, someone to notice, someone to carry its quiet insistence forward. I felt the weight of it pressing against me, patient and deliberate, the sense of being stalked intensifying with each passing second. I finally stepped back toward the staircase, the beam of my flashlight trembling. The presence lingered, circling the edges of perception, patient and deliberate, never crossing fully into the light, yet impossible to ignore. Each step upward felt heavier, the air thicker, as though the basement itself exhaled slowly, unwilling to release me entirely. When I emerged back into the alley, the door closed behind me with a soft creak, the night air hitting my face like relief, yet tinged with lingering dread. The city beyond seemed ordinary, quiet, indifferent. Yet I knew better. The basement, the forgotten doorway, the furniture and notes, they remembered me. They had observed, recorded, and now waited for the next encounter, patient, deliberate, insistent. I walked home more slowly than usual, shadows seeming to follow, not directly, but subtly, brushing at the edges of perception. Every alleyway, every abandoned doorway, every darkened corner now carried memory, observation, and the quiet insistence that I had been marked. The city breathed around me, patient and deliberate, filled with eyes I could not see but could feel. That night in bed, the memory of the basement haunted me. The furniture, the notes, the chalked warnings, they lingered in my mind's eye. I could feel the presence circling, patient, deliberate, a rhythm I could not shake. Even in sleep, I felt it, patient, deliberate, stalking in quiet corners, waiting for me to notice again. And I knew with an uneasy certainty that the forgotten doorways of the city would remain patient, deliberate, watching, always waiting for the next footsteps to mark, the next eyes to observe, the next person to notice. It started with an envelope, plain, unmarked, slipped through the slot of my apartment door. I had returned from another evening walk, careful to avoid the narrow alleyways that had begun to feel like corridors of watchful memory, and there it was, lying on the floor in the soft glow of the hallway light. The paper was thin, yellowed at the edges, and the handwriting was careful, deliberate, looping in ways that felt almost familiar, yet foreign, like someone who knew me but remained unseen. I hesitated before picking it up. Something in the air seemed heavier than usual, as though the envelope itself carried a weight beyond its physical form. I slid it open with trembling fingers, careful not to tear the fragile paper. Inside, a single sheet of folded stationery revealed itself, words written in careful, methodical strokes. I saw it happen. You don't know me, but I've watched. You walk the alleys. You notice what others do not. You are careful, too careful, but you miss the small things. I see them, and I see you. I read the words twice before setting the letter on the table. My pulse thrummed in my ears. Whoever had written this was aware of my movements, my routines. The calm streets, the alleyways I thought were empty. Someone had seen them through my eyes or had been there before me, waiting. The next day, another letter arrived. Similar envelope, similar handwriting. I debated whether to open it, but my curiosity, stubborn and insistent, pushed me forward. Inside was a short story, described in unnervingly vivid detail, recounting a crime I had never witnessed, a robbery that left a man beaten, a wallet stolen, the events of which I had only read in passing in the local news. And yet the writer's perspective was intimate, precise, almost as if I were reading the scene from someone who had stood beside the victim, unseen, observing every tremor, every shiver. The writing unsettled me in ways that were difficult to describe. It was calm, almost gentle in tone, as if the person behind it wished to draw me into their world quietly, without urgency, without alarm. And yet the effect was the opposite. My apartment felt smaller, every shadow a whisper, every creak a footstep I could not locate. I began to notice subtle things in the days that followed. The small table near my door, where letters always appeared, began to gather dust that seemed recently disturbed. A book I left on the couch would be shifted slightly when I returned. I told myself it was paranoia, that the city, the building, and my own clumsiness explained it all. But the letters had begun to arrive with a rhythm that matched my own unease, patient and deliberate, insistent, like a heartbeat in the quiet. One evening, I opened the latest letter and found something new. Instructions. Not direct commands, not overt threats, but small, subtle guidance, almost like a game. It told me to observe, to note, to pay attention to a particular alley, to leave a mark at a corner where a broken street lamp stood. The handwriting carried the same patient, deliberate tone, like a teacher guiding a student. But the teacher was unseen, unknown, and unnervingly aware of my every thought. I followed the instructions, partly out of curiosity, partly out of fear. The alley seemed ordinary at first, yet the shadows shifted differently, leaning as though to greet me, to measure me. The broken lamp flickered in irregular intervals, throwing light over objects I might not have noticed otherwise. A discarded shoe, a bottle, a scrap of paper with a name barely visible. I realized with a chill that these were traces, perhaps planted, perhaps observed, marking a path only I could see, only I could follow. Another letter arrived days later, shorter this time, almost intimate in tone. You walked the path. You noticed. Good, keep noticing. You are learning, and I am learning too. The calmness of the words made my skin crawl. It was not anger, not threat, but observation, patience, awareness. The alleyways, the letters, the hidden traces, they were all connected, part of a silent, deliberate system, and I was a participant whether I wished to be or not. I began to feel the presence even when no letters had arrived. Shadows shifted in ways that suggested calculation, movement measured and deliberate. A flicker of motion behind a fence, a soft shift in a stack of boxes, a sound that was barely audible yet unmistakably intentional. It was as though the city itself had become a room of watchful eyes, patient and deliberate, keeping record of every step I took. The letters became more descriptive, recounting crimes that were local but obscure, ones I had only seen in headlines, or perhaps never at all. I began to notice subtle patterns in the words, phrasing that suggested a voice familiar with me, with my thoughts, with the smallest habits I thought were private. A habit of pausing at street corners, of adjusting my jacket, of glancing over my shoulder. Every detail recorded, every action noted, and each letter carried it back to me, patient and deliberate. I tried to confide in friends and coworkers, but the words sounded absurd when spoken aloud. Letters in the mail, observation, the feeling of being watched. I sounded like a ghost telling a story to the living. And yet the letters kept coming, patient, deliberate. Each one a reminder that someone, somewhere, knew me, knew my routines, knew the paths I chose. One evening, I found a letter tucked not through the door but slipped under my apartment window. I could not see the person placing it, nor could I hear them, yet I felt their awareness in the air, thick and deliberate. Inside, the words were simpler than before. I have been here, I have seen everything, and I know you are here too. The simplicity of it unsettled me more than any elaborate story. It implied a quiet mastery, a patient, deliberate knowledge. The alleyways, the letters, the faint, shifting shadows, they were all part of a continuum, a network of awareness, and I was caught within it. Sleep became uneasy. Every noise, every distant footstep, every whisper of wind against my windows seemed imbued with intention. I would wake to find letters gone from the table, only to appear elsewhere, in corners I had not checked, as though the apartment itself had become part of the network, patient and deliberate, a conduit for observation. I began leaving small marks of my own, subtle notes, scraps of paper tucked behind books or under objects. Not to communicate, not to confront, but to see if the rhythm of observation was mirrored in my own actions. And I realized with a quiet, lingering dread that it was. Each note I left was noted. Each movement I made was tracked. The presence, patient, deliberate, invisible, reacted to me, mirrored me, measured me. One night I walked the alley again, letters clutched in my hand. The shadows were longer, heavier, pooling in ways that seemed impossible. I stopped at the broken lamp, and for the first time I felt a shape, a subtle shift, patient and deliberate, lingering in the darkness just beyond perception. My pulse quickened, but not in fear alone. It was awareness, recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that the alley and its unseen occupant knew me fully, intimately, and would continue to do so, patient, deliberate, for as long as I walked its paths. I returned home slowly, glancing at every corner, listening to the quiet hum of the city. The letters waited as they always had, patient, deliberate. I placed them on the table, staring at the handwriting, tracing each loop with my finger, feeling the weight of observation pressing gently against my mind. I could not see the person behind it, could not name the presence, could not fully understand their intent. Only that they knew. Only that the alleys, the city, the shadows themselves were aware. I lay awake that night, letters beside me, the faintest whisper of air through the window stirring the paper. The city outside seemed alive in a new way, patient and deliberate, watching, recording, marking, always aware. And in the quiet of my room, I realized that this presence, this observer, had become a permanent part of my life, patient, deliberate, insistent. Every step I took, every street I passed, every shadow I noticed, they were known. And as I drifted into uneasy sleep, I could not shake the certainty that the alleyways, the letters, and the presence behind them would follow, quietly, deliberately, always, through every path I walked, every window I closed, every corner I turned. They were patient, they were deliberate, and they knew me better than I knew myself. I've always preferred the rooftops. Up there, above the traffic, above the constant hum of the streets, there is a kind of quiet that the city never allows at ground level. It is rare, a fragile calm, and I have learned to protect it. My job is simple, though it often feels more like stewardship. I maintain the water tanks, sweep the ledges, and check that the old vents are secure. Most nights, I am alone, the only witness to the city's secret skyline, its neon reflections, the occasional glint of someone on another rooftop. The night began like any other. The air was cool, brushing my face as I stepped out of the small caretaker's room. The city stretched out below me, a soft pulse of lights and distant horns. I moved across the roof with practiced steps, sweeping dust from the vents and checking the perimeter. My flashlight beam touched the edge of the stairwell hatch and then swept out across the wide expanse, lingering on pipes and drains, the outlines of old satellite dishes, and the occasional loose rooftop tile. It was around the middle of my rounds that I noticed something small shift at the far end of the roof. At first, I thought it was the wind. A chair, old and rusting, rocked gently, though there had been no gust. I froze. The movement was deliberate, almost aware, slow, almost too slow to be the wind. I told myself it was imagination, a trick of the light, the mind filling in shapes where there was nothing. But then it moved again. And I realized, with a tightening in my chest, that it had been too intentional, too measured. I approached carefully, each footfall muffled on the tarred surface. The chair sat alone, no one near it, and yet it seemed positioned as if someone had just stood from it. The air felt heavier, charged with a quiet insistence I could not name. I ran a hand over the back of the chair. It was cold, colder than the night air, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Nothing else on the roof seemed disturbed, no signs of entry or tampering. It was simply moving, patient, deliberate. I shook my head and moved on, dismissing it as fatigue, perhaps the early stirrings of paranoia. The city below hummed its familiar lullaby of distant traffic and faint sirens. And yet, as I approached the water tanks, I heard it, the faintest cry, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere in the surrounding buildings. My first thought was a cat, trapped or hurt. I listened, straining, letting my eyes sweep across the low walls and adjacent rooftops. The sound was soft, sorrowful, human-like in pitch. And it echoed strangely, bouncing between buildings, shifting location ever so slightly, never settling. I froze again. It was not urgent. It was not loud. It was patient, deliberate, just faint enough to draw my attention, to make me consider what I had previously ignored. I moved toward the edge of my roof, peering down to see if someone was waving for help, if someone had fallen or was trapped. Nothing. The neighboring roofs were empty, except for the occasional air conditioning unit and the faint reflection of neon from a distant billboard. Still, the cry persisted, distant yet intimate, as though the city itself had whispered a secret meant only for me. Returning to the center of the roof, I noticed something else. A small box, wooden and weathered, had appeared near the base of a water tank. I had been there minutes before, checking the bolts, and it was not there. I bent down, hesitant, flashlight sweeping across the surface. The box was unlocked, the lid slightly ajar. Inside, I found a set of small items, a notebook, a cracked pen, and a single photograph. The photograph showed a rooftop eerily familiar in outline, though I did not recognize the people in it. They were standing in poses that suggested a frozen moment, captured deliberately. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I shifted the flashlight beam, patient, deliberate. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps someone had been on the roof before my shift, left the items, and retreated. But no, the doors were locked, the ladder padlocked, and I had been the first person up tonight. The thought settled in my chest like a stone. The items had appeared by themselves, or someone had placed them here in silence, in a way I could not detect, in a manner that insisted I notice without seeing. The faint cries returned, closer now, echoing from the next building over. I moved cautiously, flashlight beam sweeping across vents, ledges, and the narrow gaps between buildings. Every shadow seemed alive, stretching in ways the dim light should not allow. I had walked these rooftops countless nights, yet never felt so aware, so exposed, so deliberately observed. I returned to the box, notebook in hand. Flipping it open, I found pages of handwriting, neat but slightly erratic. Entries described movements across rooftops, small incidents, conversations overheard, minor crimes noticed but never reported. The words were calm, clinical, almost whispering as I read them silently. Yet there was a sense of presence behind them, patient and deliberate, aware of every step I took, every glance I cast across the cityscape. The cries stopped. The wind died, leaving an unnatural stillness in the air. And then I heard the softest shuffle behind me. I swung the flashlight. Nothing. The rooftop remained empty, save for the chair, the water tanks, and the items in the box. My pulse quickened, yet I remained still, listening. Every city noise had faded into the background. Only the echo of my own breathing and the faint creak of tar beneath my feet filled the space. I began to pace slowly, flashlight in hand, circling the roof. Each step seemed measured, deliberate, as though the building itself were aware, guiding me through a path it had chosen. I glanced at the edges of neighboring roofs and noticed subtle movements, perhaps nothing more than shadows shifting with the breeze, yet deliberate enough to pull my attention, to suggest awareness, to insist on observation. By the time I checked the far water tank, the box and its contents were gone. I searched the area carefully, retracing my steps, flashlight sweeping across every surface. Nothing. It had disappeared as silently as it had appeared, leaving behind only the echo of its presence, the lingering idea that someone or something had been here, patient, deliberate, and intent on remaining unseen. I leaned against the railing, looking out over the city, feeling a strange mix of calm and unease. From this height, the streets below seemed orderly, distant, almost peaceful. But up here in the quiet of the rooftops, the air felt charged with hidden movements, soft sounds, faint cries that might not have come from any person I could recognize. The city above the city was alive, patient, deliberate, and aware of every step I took. As the night deepened, I performed the final rounds, checking vents, water tanks, and ledges. The cries had faded into silence, leaving only the occasional subtle movements, shadows stretching slightly too long, a faint creak in the structure, a breeze that stirred objects without explanation. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, yet the awareness lingered. The feeling that eyes, patient and deliberate, had traced my every movement, had marked my presence, and would continue to do so as long as I remained on these rooftops. When I finally descended the stairs, locking the hatch behind me, I carried the memory of the box, the photograph, and the whispers in my mind. The streets below were familiar and calm, yet the rooftop above remained alive in memory, patient, deliberate, insistent. I knew I would return. I could not resist the quiet pull of those heights, the strange allure of being just above everything yet deeply entwined with the unknown, aware of a presence that watched with patient intent. And as I lay in bed later, city noises distant and muffled, I thought of the chair, the box, the faint cries, and the soft, deliberate movements. The city above the city remained patient, deliberate, and alive with secrets I could feel but not fully comprehend. The night was long, and I knew with quiet certainty that the presence lingered still. Patient, deliberate, waiting for the next evening, the next steps, the next observation. The morning after the first strange night, I returned to the rooftops, drawn back by a mixture of duty and curiosity. The city felt different from up here, quieter in a way that made the small, overlooked details easier to notice. It was early, and the sun had not yet fully risen. The air was crisp, brushing my face with a cool insistence that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I carried my flashlight anyway, though daylight would soon take its place, a small comfort in the uncertain spaces of the roof. As I moved past the water tanks and the rusted vents, I noticed objects I hadn't seen before. Newspapers, yellowed and brittle, were scattered near the far edge. Some had fallen from a storage box I had never known was there, their edges curling like leaves drying on a cold morning. Among them were missing person posters, corners pinned under bricks or tiles as if someone had left them there deliberately. The images were faded, the eyes of the lost staring up at me, haunting and patient. I could feel them following me even as I shifted my gaze, their stories suspended in time on the roof that no one visited. I knelt and picked up one of the newspapers. The headline described a mugging, a late-night robbery near the building's entrance decades ago. The words were ordinary, yet reading them here, so high above the streets, they felt charged with significance, as though the details mattered more now than when first printed. I traced the date with my finger, noticing the yellowed ink and the faint smudge where someone had clearly handled the paper. Someone had remembered these stories. Someone, or something, had kept them here. I picked up a missing person poster next. A young woman, her smile frozen in black and white, her hair tucked behind her ears. The paper was brittle, edges torn in some places, but the image seemed almost alive under the morning light. I read the description slowly, memorizing the details. She had disappeared years ago, the case unsolved, leaving only this image, this whisper of a life. A shiver ran down my spine. Why had it been placed here, so high, so far from the streets she had walked? Why leave reminders where no one would normally see them? I set the poster down carefully and continued my rounds. Each step carried a quiet awareness. The roof, usually a place of calm, seemed to have a subtle weight tonight, as though it were holding its breath, listening to me as much as I listened to it. I noticed small piles of newspapers near other vents, clippings about petty thefts, fights, and minor fires, all stories from decades past, all tied in some way to this building. It was as if the roof itself remembered, kept a ledger of crimes and losses that the city below had long since forgotten. Moving toward the corner closest to the neighboring building, I felt a slight shift in the air. A presence, patient and deliberate, seemed to linger just beyond my line of sight. I could not see it, and yet I knew it was there. The sense of being watched was subtle, not urgent, but persistent. It was not threatening in the way someone might intend harm, but it was aware, quiet, deliberate, like a shadow holding its place in the world without motion. I paused, flashlight sweeping across the scattered newspapers and posters. The edges of the roof seemed to stretch further than they should have, the shadows of the neighboring structures creeping just slightly closer, holding their distance, watching me examine the stories. I realized then that the objects, the papers, the posters, the small, forgotten items, were part of a pattern, a map of memory, a careful chronicling of things most people would dismiss. And I was intruding on it, a quiet witness to their persistence. I picked up another newspaper, one that had slipped partially under a vent. Its story described a burglary, an abandoned apartment with items left in odd arrangements, small traces of lives interrupted. Reading it, I could not help but think of the chair I had seen moving the night before, the box, and the faint cries. The stories were linked, I realized, not just through geography but through attention, observation. Someone had been watching the city, quietly, carefully, and their gaze had left traces, waiting for someone else to notice. The presence at the edge of the roof remained. I did not hear footsteps, nor did I see movement. It was a feeling, a weight in the air, patient and deliberate. I tried to convince myself it was imagination, a trick of the early light combined with memory of the previous night. But the papers shifted under the soft breeze, just enough to suggest motion, just enough to remind me that I was not entirely alone. I found a stack of missing person posters near the ventilation shaft. Their images, worn with age, showed faces I could not name, all eyes staring outward, patient and deliberate in their silent appeal. I ran my fingers along the edges, feeling the texture of paper, the faint embossing from ink pressed decades ago. Each face seemed to carry a story, and each story seemed aware of me, aware that I was here, reading, nodding, observing. The weight of all those absent lives pressed softly against my chest. I noticed then that some of the newspapers had been marked with pencil, small circles and underlines that suggested someone had highlighted particular names or phrases. The handwriting was careful, methodical, patient, deliberate. I had the sense that whoever had done this had wanted these stories to matter, wanted someone to read them, to witness them. And perhaps, in some quiet, subtle way, they had chosen me. As I moved closer to the far edge of the roof, a scrap of paper caught my eye. It was not a newspaper or a poster, but a handwritten note, fragile and yellowed. I unfolded it carefully. The words were brief. "Do you see them? They are always here, always patient, always deliberate." I felt a chill despite the sunlight on my skin. The words were familiar in their tone, echoing the deliberate awareness I had felt on the roof the night before. The presence had been patient, deliberate then, and it remained so now, entwined with these forgotten stories, lingering among the newspapers and posters. I stepped back, allowing my eyes to scan the rooftop once more. The city below felt distant, calm, oblivious to the quiet accumulation of memory above it. The air seemed to press softly against me, not in threat, but in insistence, patient and deliberate. I sensed that the roof had become a repository, a silent archive of lives interrupted, crimes forgotten, and observations left behind. And I had stumbled into it, a witness chosen, a reader of quiet histories. For a long while I remained in the center of the roof, letting the soft morning wind brush past, tracing the outlines of vents, water tanks, and scattered papers. I thought of the chair from the night before, the box, the faint cries. I thought of the missing faces on the posters, the stories in the yellowed newspapers. I thought of the presence, patient and deliberate, just beyond the edge of sight. And I understood finally that this rooftop was not empty. It had never been empty. The stories, the papers, the echoes of lives past, they were all here, patient, deliberate, observing. And so I too became patient, deliberate, a quiet participant in the slow chronicle of memory and attention that the rooftop kept. As I prepared to leave, gathering a few of the newspapers to store safely inside the caretaker room, I felt the presence linger one last time. No sound, no movement, just awareness, patient and deliberate. The rooftop remained, as it always had, a city above the city, filled with forgotten stories, faint cries, and the quiet insistence of observation. I descended the stairs slowly, carrying the weight of the papers and the memory of the presence with me. The streets below were busy, indifferent, unaware of the quiet archive above, and yet I knew with an unsettling calm that the roof was waiting, patient, deliberate, and full of stories that would not be ignored, not by me, not by anyone who dared to notice. Descending the stairwell felt different from any other night. I had walked these steps countless times before, routine, mechanical, familiar. Tonight, though, each step seemed to stretch longer, the echoes lingering, resonating in ways that the narrow concrete shaft shouldn't allow. I gripped the cold metal railing, feeling the rusted edges bite lightly into my palm, grounding me as I tried to convince myself that the roof, the papers, and the whispers of the previous nights had all been figments of a half-asleep imagination. The first few steps were ordinary. The air smelled faintly of damp concrete and rust, a familiar scent that usually brought nothing more than a quiet awareness of the building's age. But now, the air carried something else, a faint metallic tang. Sharp but almost imperceptible, like the scent of iron left behind after a wound heals. I paused, head tilting, listening. The stairwell was silent, or so it seemed, but the silence had weight. It pressed against me, patient, deliberate, aware. I stepped down again. The echo of my boots sounded longer than it should have, bouncing off the concrete walls as if the stairwell itself had been stretched, reshaped to hold sound in a way that made my ears ache slightly. I told myself it was the acoustics, the narrow shaft acting like a chamber, but the feeling in my chest told me it was more than that. Something waited below, patient, deliberate, just beyond the point I could see. I reached the midpoint landing and stopped, leaning against the railing. The faint light from the roof above barely penetrated this part of the stairwell, leaving shadows that moved in impossible ways. I could see the outlines of old graffiti, faded warnings and small scrawls, names, dates, cryptic notes etched into the concrete. Some of them I recognized from the papers and posters on the roof. Others were new, darker, sharper, and somehow more deliberate. The building had a memory. It remembered. And now it was showing me. As I continued down, the faintest sounds began to accompany my descent. Footsteps. No, not my own. They were softer, irregular, and seemed to echo in patterns I could not predict. They moved below me, above me, around me. My pulse quickened, but I kept my voice calm inside my head, repeating quietly that nothing would harm me, that this was a building, just concrete and metal. Still, the echoes persisted, following, anticipating, patient and deliberate. I passed an old landing where a broken window let in a slice of cold night air. The city lights spilled through, reflecting off the stairwell walls in fractured patterns. And then I saw it, a shadow. Not a person, not fully formed, just a silhouette that seemed to flicker at the edge of my vision. I froze. The shadow did not move in the way a human would. It seemed aware of me, adjusting, waiting, patient and deliberate. When I shifted my gaze, it was gone, but the sense of it lingered, like a weight pressing against my back. I tried to focus on the stairs, counting each step aloud in my mind. 1, 2, 3, each number a lifeline to reality, a small act of control. The shadow, however, seemed unconcerned with counting, unconcerned with my attempts to anchor myself. It existed in the pauses, in the corners of my vision, in the moments between my deliberate thoughts. And I knew, instinctively, that it would continue to exist as long as I moved through this place, patient, deliberate, observing. By the time I reached the lower landing, the stairwell had grown colder. The air seemed thicker, heavier, pressing against my lungs in a subtle, insistent way. I shivered, drawing my jacket closer, and noticed the faint smell of paper and ink, old newspapers pressed against damp walls, clinging to the edges of the steps. Each smell, each echo, carried with it a memory, a story, a presence. The building remembered more than I could imagine. I moved carefully, hand trailing along the railing, listening. And then I heard it clearly, soft, deliberate, patient. A shuffle, the faintest scuffing of a shoe, following me down each step. My breath caught. I stopped mid-step, holding perfectly still. The sound continued, though it shifted, moving ahead of me now, a silent warning. I took another step, slow, deliberate, and the sound echoed my movement, though slightly delayed, slightly distorted. It was no longer just a shadow or a smell or a feeling. It had become intent. I reached the final flight, the last dozen steps leading to the lobby. The stairwell seemed longer than it should have been, stretching impossibly into darkness. My flashlight flickered as I raised it, illuminating the concrete walls with pale, wavering light. And there, just beyond the beam, something moved. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with patience, with deliberation. A shadow coalesced against the wall, thin, tall, impossible to define fully. I knew it could see me as clearly as I could see it, that it existed in the space between light and dark, waiting. I gripped the railing harder. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, loud, rhythmic, human. The shadow did not flinch. It remained patient, deliberate, observing. I whispered to myself softly to keep control, to remind myself I was safe, that this was concrete, metal, and light. But the whisper came back, not mine. It was softer, distant, almost carried by the walls themselves. A voice, faint, deliberate, patient, whispering my name. I froze. My name, spoken softly but unmistakably, carried down the stairwell like smoke. I could feel it curling around me, wrapping through the steps, pressing against my ears, against my mind. I told myself it was the wind, the acoustics, a trick of memory and fear. But I knew with the kind of certainty that seeps into your bones that the presence from the rooftops had followed me here. Patient, deliberate, observing. Step by step, I moved closer to the final landing. The stairwell seemed endless, even though I knew it could not be. The faint light above flickered, shadows danced unnaturally across the walls, and the whispers, soft, deliberate, continued. My skin crawled, every nerve alert, and yet my movements were calm, deliberate, patient. I had to reach the bottom. I had to complete the final step. At the last landing, I paused and looked back up the stairwell. The shadow was gone, but the feeling remained. The air was thick with attention, patient, deliberate, unseen. I felt a faint pulse, as though the building itself was alive or something hidden within it, aware of me, aware of my presence. I inhaled slowly, letting my breath steady me, and then lowered myself carefully onto the final step. The whisper returned, closer now, softer, impossibly gentle, my name spoken as though it had always been waiting for me to hear it. The sound curled around my mind, patient and deliberate, filling the silence, bending it to attention. I held still, listening. The concrete beneath me was solid, the railing cold in my hand, yet I knew that something patient and deliberate existed just beyond my vision. Waiting, watching, silent except for the faint echo of my name. I descended the final step, letting my foot touch the floor of the lobby. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, cold and harsh after the soft shadows of the stairwell. And yet I could still feel it. The presence, patient, deliberate, lingering just beyond sight, just beyond sound, as if it had followed me through the air, through the stairs, through the spaces that no one else could see. I paused, listening to the normal sounds of the lobby, a distant HVAC hum, a muffled car horn from outside, the faint shuffle of a janitor somewhere in the building. All ordinary, all mundane. Yet in the back of my mind, I carried the memory of the stairwell, of the shadow, of the whispered name, patient and deliberate. I knew it had not left. It could not leave. The building had retained it, and I had become a witness, a participant, part of a story it would continue to tell. I left the stairwell slowly, keeping my steps deliberate, patient, careful. Every instinct screamed to run, to escape, to leave the building and never return. But another part of me, a quieter, more stubborn part, knew I would return. The building had stories to tell, shadows to show, whispers to impart, and I had become their chosen reader. Patient, deliberate, observant. As I stepped into the open air outside the building, the city greeted me with its usual cacophony of distant horns and muffled voices. But the memory of the stairwell, of the shadow, and of that whispered name stayed with me, curling quietly at the edges of my mind. I knew it would return, patient and deliberate, waiting for the next step, the next night, the next descent. And for a long time, I stood there, letting the city breathe around me, feeling the weight of attention, patient and deliberate, reminding me that the final step was never truly final. It only led deeper into the story, deeper into the quiet presence that had followed me from the rooftops into the shadows of the stairwell.